Okay, so if we can kick off and welcome everybody to this morning's session. My name is David Grant. I'm the Chief Executive at the Irish College in Leuven, and in partnership with the Northern and Western Regional Assembly, we have been working with them in putting the programme together for this week. As many of you will know, we had the session on Monday with the speakers from the European Commission, and today we have a number of speakers on different topics within the Green Deal that we hope are going to be of interest to the various attendees in the different sectors that you work in. We work a lot with the Northern and Western Regional Assembly in normal times, obviously based at our campus in Leuven in Belgium in the historic Irish College, and for reasons we're all familiar with, such events are no longer possible at the moment. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to be involved in a programme like this and to work with them in putting together Monday, today and on Friday as well. Just a couple of housekeeping matters first before we start, just to advise that the session is being recorded and that the NWRA will post it on their YouTube and share it on their social media channels once we have the recording complete. They'll also have the same for Monday and for Friday as well. All the presenters have also agreed to share with us the presentations that they're making. So at the end of the week, when we have the full set of presentations, again, the NWRA will make them available to everybody who has signed up as well. The format for this morning is we have 4 speakers in 4 different areas. Each one will more or less start on the hour, starting next with Adrian Hill. Then we'll have Elmer Williams on the circular economy, Dr. Mike Clark on biodiversity, and Dr. Mallory Schultz and Milan Elkerbout in relation to the Green Deal and industry. We will allow each of the speakers 45-50 minutes or so on their presentation, and then we will open it to questions on each session as we go through, rather than waiting until the end. So anyone who has any questions on each of the topics, feel free to pop them into the chat, and I will moderate them then and ask the panelists to respond to your queries. The first speaker that I want to introduce, says his name is Adrian Hill. He is Canadian by birth, but he's been living in Brussels now for about 17 years, and much of that time he has spent working in the area of EU affairs. For the last 2 years, he's been part of the Energy Cities Policy Team, which is a network of 1,000 cities in 30 countries driving citizen-led energy transition. There are 2 main goals to Adrian's work. Firstly, to ensure that the needs and concerns of cities are addressed in EU legislation, such as the Renovation Wave, the Renewable Energies Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, and other items that the Commission spoke to us about on Monday. Secondly, to collect and share the best examples of what Energy Cities members can do and have accomplished, and to inspire legislators in Brussels and beyond to be bold and to be brave. The next comment I never thought I would mention, but in his spare time, Adrian enjoys his role as a living GAA legend and probably the greatest ever Canadian hurler in Belgium. So strange words to start the day, but thank you, Adrian, for taking part in our national games, and we look forward to seeing you togged out in Belgium, maybe even in Leuven sometime soon. So Adrian, if I can hand the floor over to you to share your presentation, and we'll come back then with questions at the end. Thank you.
I'll share my screen here, and we'll get started. Sorry for that, folks, about the technical difficulties in starting. Now, just to confirm, you can in fact see my screen with the big Energy Cities logo on the front of it, right?
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah, excellent.
Grand. Okay, let's get started then, because the energy component of the Green Deal is fairly substantial. There's a lot to it. So I'm gonna give a very brief overview as much as I can, and then try and get as much discussion as possible, just so that I can directly address any questions that people have, just to try and make this as useful as possible for everyone. The Green Deal in brief, when it comes to energy, is really, really simple. Fewer emissions, more renewable energy, much more aggressive 2030 targets, and of course the net zero target for 2050. The really substantial change in that is the net zero by 2050 target, because it fundamentally changes how we look at what we're doing on a city level, on an industrial level, and everything else. Whereas previously, there's been a lot of government programs and a lot of initiatives to make things like heating more efficient, which might mean replacing turf or oil with a condensing gas boiler. When you're looking at a net zero 2050 target, all of a sudden that gas boiler becomes a rather inefficient intermediary step. So what we're seeing in the reaction to the Green Deal is a move or an awareness that it's no longer enough to be more efficient. We have to figure out how we remove those emissions entirely. So it's not about burning fossil fuels more efficiently, it's about how do we remove them. And that removal is a really fundamental change to how we look at things, the advocacy that we do in Brussels, and the needs of the national programs to meet the targets of the Green Deal. I just really wanted to underline that because it's a point that gets lost. It just sounds like you can keep doing becoming more and more efficient until you get there, but that's not the case. It really becomes a case of removing those fossil fuels entirely, and that brings with it a whole slew of complexities, of course. Cities are implicitly at the center of the Green Deal in general, but also in terms of energy. We see a much stronger role for things like community energy in the Green Deal, because community energy can do a number of things. It can put renewable energy generation in places where other sort of commercial enterprises can't, in terms of getting onto rooftops within cities, on municipal buildings, on schools and whatnot. And it also really crucially accesses financing that other ways of rolling out renewables cannot, because those are community funds, those are people investing their own money. There's a lot of, I'd say that there's not a lot to be gained by putting your money in a bank these days. So community energy provides a way for people to gain a decent return while also growing the amount of renewable energies that are generated in our cities. So we see community energy as having quite a strong role going forward in the energy mix. I know Ireland now is just experimenting with its first attempts at this. That's in reaction to the Clean Energy for All package that came into effect last year in the EU. And there's going to be, I know, a lot more variations in playing with that at a national level in Ireland to figure out those rules, but we see community energy growing more and more. Of course, there's things like the renovation wave, and within the renovation wave, there's one really, really big fundamental point for cities, and that's the mandatory renovation of government-owned buildings. Now, previously, there was a target that national governments had to renovate their buildings, but that obligation has been extended to municipal, local, regional governments as well. So your local county council office, it could be a local school, libraries. The exact terms have yet to be defined, and that'll be done on a national level. But there's a very good chance that every building that a local government owns or operates will have to be renovated. One of the major points for the energy part of the Green Deal is sector integration, which is, to my mind, it's like a mobility plan for heat. And it's about moving away from thinking about energy just in terms of electricity. You know, do you get it from gas or nuclear or renewables or what have you? And it's about looking at the heat that we use. Most of the, 40% of Europe's energy comes from or is used on heat, and decarbonizing that is going to be a massive challenge. And a big part of it is going to be sector integration, where you're taking waste heat from industry, of course, because there you've got a lot of really high temperature heat, but also things like supermarkets, wastewater facilities, data centers. Dublin is just launching its first district heating network, and it's the heat that feeds into that district network is coming from an Amazon data center. So that's something that's quite new and quite experimental in terms of the commercial arrangement, but the actual engineering behind it is really straightforward and well understood at this point. So sector integration is a big focus. And then, of course, for cities, there's also things like public transport and the circular economy, which you'll hear about from other people. But the main message is that all of these things in the Green Deal have to be implemented at a city level. And one thing that's quite concerning to us is that the national energy and climate plans and the resilience plans that are being rolled out at the moment and designed at the moment generally don't reflect the needs of cities, and cities aren't being consulted. If you take one message away from today, it's especially that the resilience package that is due from the Irish government to the European Commission in April. Cities need to be very, very clear and very loud about what they need to be in that package. It's going to be a lot of spending over the next 2-3 years. And I would strongly encourage you to get in touch with the good people in Dublin and make it very clear what you need from them in terms of their spending. 37% of it is supposed to go to green things. The renovation of buildings is a perfect example where that money can be spent reducing emissions, but also really helping local economies, building really good jobs. And you've got the other benefits as well, of course, of people living in better homes and better health outcomes. So that's sort of the really sweeping overview. In terms of what was done in 2020 after the launch of the Green Deal, you had 3 major initiatives for decarbonizing energy. The first was the smart sector integration, which I spoke about already a bit. I'm not sure to what extent the Northwest is going to be able to use that. District heating usually depends on having a certain density of housing to use that heat. It's very possible, of course, to build a district heating network that's hundreds of kilometers long. The Dutch are doing it right now. But I would think that the density of housing is going to make that a real struggle in the Northwest. And so things like decarbonizing heating will probably depend more on heat pumps. The renovation wave is a massive document, and there's lots in there. The big thing, as I said, is the mandatory renovation of government-owned buildings. What we're discussing now and what's being lobbied about now is what constitutes a renovated building. If you cut your emissions, there's a proposal on the table that if the emissions in the building are cut by 30%, then that's fine. There's a counter proposal that it should be 60 or 70%. So that's obviously a big difference. You can hit 30% fairly easily just with a bit of insulation and double glazed windows. 60% demands a much more holistic overhaul of the building, looking at the building fabric, looking at the heating system and everything else. So that's one thing to really look out for, and we hope to have a resolution on that by the end of the year, but it could well go into 2022 by the time the Parliament has their say on things. Other things in the renovation wave that are going to be really interesting is the energy performance certificates. Now, currently, in Ireland, if you have an A-rated house, that's brilliant. You've got a really efficient house. You can be quite comfortable. It's probably running on heat pumps as it is. But the way those ratings are done oftentimes is a bit of a haphazard guess. You can just say, well, it was built in 85 and it's breeze block, and so it's probably about a D. So there's a proposal there that all of the performance certificates for buildings will be standardized across the EU to make that information shareable. But it's also a view to creating sort of what they call the European Building Observatory, which is a central repository of information on buildings. When was it built? When was it extended? When was the attic insulated? All of these sorts of things. And that becomes a building logbook where all the relevant energy information is gathered on a building. Not entirely dissimilar from what you'd have on your car, where when you go to your MOT, you can show that it's had all of its necessary services over the lifespan of the car. There's a lot of There's also proposals in there for the use of minimum renewable energy consumption or generation in the building. Right now, the proposal that the Commission has put forward is that the building should consume a certain percentage of renewable energy. There are attempts by some people in Brussels to change that to a minimum generation. So that means you have to have some generating capacity on the house or on the apartment building, the retail building, what have you. I'm not entirely clear how all this is going to apply to agricultural buildings. And that's something that will come into in the EPBD, which is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, there's a proposal that is due at the end of this year. Obviously, agricultural buildings don't need to be A-rated. Sheep have a fine wool coat. They don't need great insulation as well. They have their own. The other big thing is, of course, offshore renewable energy, which the Commission sees as really the base generation for Europe's grid in 2050. So there's a huge ramp up there. Right now, we've got about 12 gigawatts in Europe offshore, and the Commission wants to see 300 gigawatts by 2050. I don't think it's any secret. You'll see a lot of growth in offshore wind off the west coast of Ireland. I know there's already discussions about floating offshore wind, creating hydrogen and whatnot. Go easy on the hydrogen hype. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty as to where hydrogen will end up, its final role in the energy mix. Offshore renewable will definitely play a role in terms of generating the electricity for the electrolysis. But in terms of, proposals to see hydrogen in things like cars, or especially in home heating, that to our mind is really a non-starter. And agreeing with us last week, the head of buildings at the European Commission made it very clear that he sees no role for hydrogen in home heating. And in Germany last week, they launched their national debate on how to get to net zero by 2050. And there again, the Minister for Energy and Economy made it clear that there's no role for hydrogen in home heating. I know in the UK, they're much more keen on it, but frankly, it's just far, far less efficient, and it's going to be far, far more expensive than other options like just insulating the house properly and putting in a heat pump. Upcoming in 2021, this is from the European Commission's work plan. You can see there's a whole slew of things there, things like methane emissions in the energy sector that I don't think are terribly relevant for you. But I've highlighted 5 things there that I think are quite important. And I'll explain why. So the first thing is a revision of the EU emissions trading system. Now, there's not an obvious role for cities there, but whilst they're talking about expanding it to things like maritime shipping, aviation, and other sectors, there's also a strong likelihood that it might be applied to buildings. And that's going to have the immediate effect of making home heating with fossil fuels more expensive. Now, whether that happens or not, honestly, I wouldn't put money on it right now because I just don't know. There's a lot of people for and against it. And there are more, certainly in our opinion, there's more effective ways to decarbonize buildings than including it in the ETS. What we are advocating for, though, is that money from the ETS and as well from the Energy Efficiency Directive, that the money that's generated there needs to be recycled and given to local authorities to implement a lot of these efficiency measures. The ETS is only going to grow in the years to come as the price increases. It's up to about €40 a ton right now, which is far higher than it's ever been before, and it's gone up 33% in the last month or so. How much higher it goes, no one really knows, but they're talking about €100 a ton anytime between 2025 and 2030. So that fundamentally changes the equation when you're looking at using fossil fuels. It'll be really, really interesting to follow that. The amendment for the Renewable Energy Directive, the consultation for that closed last week. It is largely what you would expect. We need more renewable energy if we're going to hit the new targets for 2030, what they call the Fit for 55 package. So that's the 55% reduction in emissions by 2030 from a 1990 baseline. And just a reminder, if I'm not mistaken, Ireland's emissions are currently higher now than they were in 1990. And they were supposed to be, I think the target for Ireland was a 20% reduction by 2020. So Ireland is going to have to drastically change how it does things over the next decade if it hopes to hit those targets, those emissions targets. And there's a very good chance that while the 2020 emissions reduction targets were not binding, the 2030 ones will be. And so not hitting them is going to be very, very expensive. It'll be far cheaper to make the kind of wholesale changes that are needed up front and as quickly as possible, rather than not hitting them and paying fines. I know Ireland is already well engaged on trying to rework things now, but expect a lot more changes to come, especially, as I said, with that recovery facility and the national energy and climate plans. Another directive that's being changed is the Energy Efficiency Directive. And there's a whole slew of things in there, and it's far from certain what those changes will be ultimately. Again, the consultation for that closed last week, so we're at the very first stages of the changes to the directive. We should have a final proposal from the Commission at the end of June on both the Renewable Energy Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive. From our point of view, a lot of the things that we're pushing is one for mandatory heat mapping. So that would be a national obligation that governments have to make sure that there's a heat mapping for local areas throughout the country. And to us, it's a no-brainer first step that you have to do if you're going to do proper sector integration and use the waste heat that's available out there. Some of the other things is, of course, that's where we're talking about recycling the fines from not hitting efficiency targets. We want those recycled and given to local authorities to implement Green Deal objectives. As well, then there's also the matter of taxation and how we tax fuels, which comes in both Energy Efficiency Directive and the Energy Tax Directive, which, okay, according to their work plan here, they had hoped to have it by Q2 of 2021. That's been pushed back towards the end of the year now. But currently, the way we tax energy is badly skewed, and understandably so. We spent decades trying to get people to burn the cleanest possible things at the cheapest possible prices for very good reasons. We're now at a point where we need to get people to stop burning fossil fuels and switch to electricity. So in Ireland, for example, electricity has 3 times the taxes and levies that gas would have. So shifting that balance to make electricity cheaper and to make burning fossil fuels more expensive has to happen. Otherwise, you cannot. It gets very difficult to force someone to put in a heat pump if you're also telling them that their energy bills are going to go through the roof. So that's a change that's going to happen in the way we tax energy. It is a matter largely for the member states, though. It's Dublin that will decide how and when to get that done. But there's no question that that shift is going to happen. So when you're looking at business plans for renovations, for renovating buildings and operating costs, keep in mind that electricity is very likely to get cheaper in the future, and fossil fuels are very, very likely to get more expensive, which changes things quite dramatically. And then the last thing is the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And I'll go through the next few slides here because I'm kind of talking over myself instead of using the slides that I've written. So yeah, as I said, the emissions trading system, will it be extended to buildings and vehicles? Honestly, I really don't think it'll be extended to vehicles. That is one of the things that's being discussed right now. But fuel standards work far more effectively in terms of decarbonizing transport. Ireland already has a fairly ambitious target of getting EVs on the road. And along with that, there's an EU initiative to increase the number of charging stations. So you can expect targets imposed on Ireland for the number of EV charging stations that it has to have, which, to be honest, should be fine. And it goes hand in hand with a sort of the revision of the grid and the investment in the grid that needs to be made to increase the amount of renewables that it can handle. And there's a role for community energy there too, in terms of generating and using electricity locally. You take a lot of the strain off the grid of trying to balance those renewables. Now, EirGrid is already doing, it has to be said, a fairly decent job of incorporating renewables. And we've seen Ireland's grid being powered by wind to, I don't know how, 80 or 90% now at this stage on okay, sunny, windy Sundays. But the ability to take that much power is quite impressive. The Renewable Energy Directive, yes, we're looking at higher and binding national targets for renewables. Again, Ireland won't have a problem with that. You've already got the 2030 target for 70% wind. Ireland lags badly in terms of solar, which is where community energy comes into play. Obviously, Ireland is not the greatest country in the world for solar energy, but it does have a role. And it really helps balance out the load rather than being entirely dependent on wind. So community energy should provide a really big growth for solar energy in Ireland over the next decade. As I mentioned the heat planning, right? The obligation to buy green energy. So there is a green procurement proposal on the table that would force local authorities and national governments as well to buy only green energy. It's a fairly straightforward ask, and it's an easy thing to accomplish. So I don't see anything stopping that obligation from coming into play. So that's, but that's a fairly straightforward thing to accomplish. And then you've got, binding use targets for the use of renewable heating and cooling in buildings, which is still uncertain as to how exactly that's going to be formulated. It doesn't make sense to put solar panels on every building. Frankly, if you're next to a massive building and your house is in the shade all day, then putting solar panels on that house is a waste of everyone's time and energy. You'd be far better off putting it somewhere else on a house that gets, that isn't overlooked and gets solar all day. So these are things that we're lobbying on, that are being discussed in Brussels. And as I said, hopefully we'll have more clarity on these towards the end of the year or early in 2022, when the Parliament gets its say on these proposals. The Energy Efficiency Directive, again, higher and binding national targets. We want to see specifically the EU city facility, and this is something that I would really encourage you to look into as well. The EU city facility it's a small program. I think the total funding is about 12 million euro. And what it does is it gives 60,000 euro grants to local authorities to develop a sustainable financing plan. So it's not about investing in a project. You don't invest in public transport or in renovation or anything. You develop plans and you map out financing. and you have a lot of latitude as to how that €60,000 grant can be spent. Do you want to develop your own plan? Do you want to hire someone to come in and train you? And you also get access to a national expert who will help you navigate all the different national programs. There will be a call at the end of March that will close probably in late April, maybe in May, for the next round. The first round of the EU facility was massively oversubscribed, but there were several recipients from Ireland who got money. I think there was 3 or 4 cities that got money from it. And I just really encourage you to check out the website, EU City Facility, and keep an eye on that for when the call comes out. As I mentioned, we're also looking at the reinvestment at the local level from revenue from the ETS and the non-met efficiency obligations, and developing one-stop shops. Now, a one-stop shop is, it's basically a local resource, oftentimes set up by the city, by a local authority at arm's length, where people can go and get advice, independent, judgment-free advice on what grants are out there, what they should be looking to do for their own home in terms of renovating their own home. There's a project called Orphe that we're running now that's rolling out one-stop shops in numerous EU countries. It's going to be a fairly big part of, to our mind, the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Renovation Wave, because it's a really fundamental point in demystifying renovations for people. Anyone who's renovated their own home knows that it can be a hair-pulling experience. There's lots of uncertainties. There's lots of complexities. So these one-stop shops are really about demystifying the process for local residents, helping the local supply chain, your local builders and whatnot, identify what skills they need to meet the renovation targets, and hopefully build up the skill set locally so you've got good renovations that are as smooth as one can hope in a renovation process. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, there's the revision of the Energy Tax Directive towards the end of the year, where the burden of taxes and levies that are put onto electricity will need to be shifted to gas, especially. But as I said, that's really a matter for Dublin. So we'll see how and when they tackle that issue. And then we have the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which is due at the end of this year. So this isn't about the locally government-owned buildings. This is about everyone's buildings, their residential, retail buildings, commercial buildings. The proposal will likely end up with is some sort of minimum energy performance standards. So, looking at your performance certificate for a building, it's likely to end up something as, everything needs to be C rated by 2025. Everything needs to be B rated by 2028, and by 2032, everything needs to be a B plus or an A rated building. The exact specifics of which we don't know yet. How is that going to work? But you're really talking about forcing people to upgrade their building stock, which is a very difficult thing to do. There's the financing side, which has to be there. We can't bankrupt people for wanting to live in their own homes. So we need to make sure that the financing is right. And then there's the disruption. If you want to do a great renovation, the easiest and fastest way is to move out and tear it all apart and rebuild it. But that's not likely. So one of the models that we have is here in the Brussels region at a local level. Their plan is that by 2025, every building, every home has to have an energy audit where they identify 5 different steps that need to be taken in priority. to reduce the emissions and increase the comfort of the building. The homeowner then has 5 years to complete each one of those steps. So the audit happens by 2025, and they say, okay, you need a new heating system, you have to insulate your walls, you have to insulate your attic, you need new windows, and you need a mechanical recovery ventilation, for example. And then it's up to the homeowner to say, okay, well, I want to do all of these things at once just to, you know, minimize the disruption, or because I don't have a lot of money, I need to spread this out over as long a period as possible. But again, providing the right financial support is going to be really, really key. Otherwise, people will be quite justifiably up in arms about, you know, being forced to choose. You know, no one wants a situation where people saying, well, I can't afford to feed my kids because I'm being forced to put in new windows and my current windows are fine anyway. So that process and the discussions around minimum energy performance standards is just starting. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it does happen, because there's a lot that goes along with it. It also means that your supply chain, your local builders and architects and energy consultants need to be up to snuff. We've all seen examples of renovations done on the cheap where much is promised and very little is delivered. And that's always a concern. And how you mitigate against that is going to be really interesting. Part of it will be the much more stringent energy performance certificates in buildings. Yeah, rather than a box ticking exercise of saying, well, it's got cavity walls and single glazed windows, it's going to be much more about doing, I suspect, a blower door test to see, to measure the air changes per hour, and thermal imaging to look and see where the thermal bridges that are losing heat and how many watts per meter squared are you using to heat the place. So that's a whole big can of worms that's coming down the pipeline. Now, one interesting thing is always, where's the money? This is taken from our website. There's a bunch of different projects with a lot of money. Horizon Europe runs a whole slew of projects. You see their budget at 86 billion. And there's cohesion policy. The Just Transition mechanism in Ireland is reserved for the Midlands only. So you, unless my geography is completely off, you won't be able to access money from the Just Transition Fund. But there's a number of other projects. And honestly, if I can help demystify them in any way, don't hesitate to get in touch with me after this. And yeah, where else is the money? There's the EU City Facility. ELENA is a really key program. That's a lending arm of the European Investment Bank. There's a 30 million euro minimum. It's very difficult for small cities to put together a project to access ELENA funding. But I would say that it's a great use of an EU facility grant to put together enough things in collaboration, oftentimes with other local municipalities on a regional basis, to put together enough projects to get to that 30 million euro minimum and access that funding, because that's when things really start to happen. And one last resource to look into is DG Reform. Now, DG Reform is part of the European Commission. It used to be a very IMF style support service, in that it would advocate efficiency above all else by slashing services. It's changed its mandate in the last year to provide a consultancy to help implement the Green Deal. So they can help you understand all of the projects that are out there, the rules and regulations. I haven't heard feedback yet from the support they've offered. So I can't swear that it's a vital resource, but hopefully they should be a really big help that I would also encourage you to reach out to. That's it. I'm a couple minutes over. Sorry for the delayed start, but I would welcome any questions at all that you might have now.
Great, Adrian. Thank you very much for that, very informative. So if anybody has any questions, maybe if you can pop them into the questions and answers to chat box, and we can ask Adrian in the 10 minutes or so that we still have left with him. Maybe Adrian, just while people are maybe typing in some questions there, One of the areas that you mentioned, but maybe didn't go into quite a lot, it was just around agriculture. And obviously that's a big industry in the wider sense in the Northern Western region. Just wondering, is there anything in the pipeline that's coming in that way, or is there anything that we should be aware of? Are there any opportunities? What sort of planning should people in the agricultural space be looking at over the next few years?
There's a lot of uncertainty there too. Within agriculture, of course, a lot of that is developed under the Common Agricultural Policy. But under the second pillar of the Common Agricultural Policy, there is money for renewable energy. My ideal vision would be that every farm has a windmill on it that's funded through the CAP, which helps farmers diversify their income. I'm not an expert on the Common Agricultural Policy though. And another thing to look out for is the revision of the gas package directive and the use of anaerobic digestion on farms to create your own gas source. The rules around that are likely to change, and I suspect because that will be seen as largely carbon neutral or decarbonized gas source, that sort of thing will be encouraged. But that's again another proposal that's due out later this year, so we don't know the specifics on it yet.
Okay, Frank Flanagan has asked there, so Frank, I'll give you the floor if you wish to come in there. You have to unmute yourself, Frank, I think. No, okay, maybe it was an error. Another point, Adrian, if we can, and as you rightly note, obviously the Northern Western area is much more peripheral, it's a regional area. And in terms of that collaboration though, for regional authorities and looking at a region from Donegal down to Galway and back in across into some of the Midlands, and I think some of the fund that you mentioned might be accessible maybe on the eastern side of the region where we're more in the Midlands, and there might be possibilities there. But in terms of trying to bring that region together where we have 3 or 4 major urban areas, but yet we would have a lot of hinterland around that and a lot of smaller regions. How can we look at trying to build some sort of collaboration around that geographic area?
It's a good question. I mean, that's very much a political discussion. I would say that there's a lot of synergies to be had on the energy front between what cities need and what rural areas can provide. Galway or Westport, they're never going to have enough solar panels to transition their city to renewable energy. But if you look at the potential of wind energy around those cities, there's, I think, a lot of opportunity for the rural areas to be providing electricity to the more urban areas and earning a few pennies while they do it.
Okay, I have another question in from Noel Ballantyne in the Northern Western Regional Assembly. Are there any measures for solar thermal for heating water? It isn't seen as a priority as there's no energy produced, but it does reduce CO2.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it would be seen on a par in the Renewable Energy Directive with solar voltaics. I didn't mention it, which was probably an omission on my part, but it should be included in the National Energy and Climate Plan that Dublin is putting together. And I don't know the details of Dublin's plan on that, but within the targets that are being set out for efficiency and renewable energy at an EU level, solar thermal would definitely fit in terms of attaining those binding targets.
Okay, we have another question in from Councillor Joe Sheridan in Galway, who would be really interested in the one-stop shop initiative and the Offshore project that you mentioned. In Galway, they have their own own green hub that they're working on and beginning now, and want to be a regional go-to site for dissemination on the green agenda and technology. Would you have any advice for Councillor Sheridan and those working with him in Galway in terms of trying to create that type of centre in his community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to do would be to look at the website, and I see that Joe's put his email address there, so I'll be happy to email Joe later today with all the details of the Orphe project, as well as some best practices that we've gleaned from other projects. You know, things like Frankfurt did a very good job of creating a list of recognized suppliers for people to contact. You know, so you don't, it can be very daunting. One of the most daunting things is you don't know who you're asking to do the work in your own home, and will they do a good job or not. And so Frankfurt did a really good job of coming up with an objective set of criteria to try and ensure that they had a list of contacts that people could trust, whilst also respecting the fact that as a local council, they can't say, go to Jim, but not Frank, because you don't want to trust Frank, right? They can't be that biased, but they did do a great job of coming up with objective criteria to create a list and build a bit more trust there.
Frank Green has asked a question. Frank works with the Galway Technology Centre and also a member of the European Economic and Social Committee. What about hydropower on the Corrib Estuary, which could possibly light up Galway City? What would you think of using those resources?
I wouldn't know about the Corrib Estuary exactly. I will say that hydropower is not seen as a really big growth area in terms of renewables. It brings with it a lot of upfront emissions in terms of building the hydro facilities, and there's a lot of disruption in terms of the biodiversity and impeding sort of fish stocks, and as well as it often needs some flooding to create a reservoir. So it's not, the European Commission does not see that as a big potential energy source going forward.
Okay. We have another comment there. I don't know if you want to comment on it, if you can see it there, Adrian. I'm not sure who the speaker is, IPS they're identified as, but you don't need to put solar panels on the roofs of houses. You can put them on garages and on ground facing the sun. So would you, in terms of alternative positioning of such technology, what would you?
Yeah, no, the person is absolutely right. No, of course, it doesn't have to go on the house. The important thing is that you're siting the solar panels where they get the best exposure. You know, and whether, if that's not your roof, if it's the garage, or if it's your neighbor's house, that's the most important thing.
Okay. If anyone else has any last questions, want to raise their hand or pop them in the chat box, we'll take them. But if not, Adrian, can I thank you very much for your very insightful and in-depth presentation on the policy area of energy and how the Green Deal is going to be an important part in that policy area going forward. I think too, we're all probably thinking, gosh, we've got to get more work done on the homes in our houses. And that's something I'm sure many of us are not looking forward to, but it's something we're going to have to embrace and start planning rather than waiting until 2032 to find that we're needing it. But of course, the issue there is, you know, by 2032, technologies will have changed from where they are now today in 2021. And that's something that we need to keep on top of as well, and try and see what we can plan for. I do hope that we get to see you out in Leuven, togged out with your hurl.
I've been out. I've togged out a couple of times in Leuven. We've had a good few matches. They were football rather than hurling.
That's right. We have a good side in the Leuven Earls. Yeah, they're more football than hurling, but certainly we hope that we'll have you back out, and we hope we'll have you back out in Leuven as well, maybe to give a presentation on this in a more real format rather than online. But thank you again, Adrian. I know you're under pressure to go, so look, we very much appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch again.
Thanks very much, David, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next presenter who has joined us is Elmer Williams. Elmer is going to talk to us around the Green Deal and the circular economy. And again, I'd ask if anybody has any questions to pop them in the chat, and we'll come to them at the end. Just by way of introduction, Elmer is a a neighbour, obviously, of the Irish College in Leuven, and he has been to our college and spoken to many groups in the past on the area of the circular economy. He's a long-standing policy officer at the public Flemish Waste Agency, the Regional Authority for Waste Management and Soil Policies. He has been engaged with the agency's efforts to broaden its scope and work actively in the field of resource management and the transition to a circular economy. He's a member of the operational team of Circular Flanders, and his focus lies with circular cities, circular area development and brown fields. He holds a master's degree in environmental policy sciences from Radboud University in the Netherlands, and he is co-author of the book of Local and Circular Crafting the Future. So Elmer, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. For me, it's about 11 in the morning, a.m., but I'm happy to talk to you, to be able to talk to you, and I'll share my screen. Let's see if that works. Screen 2, share. So please, David, let me know if everything's fine with the view. I guess so.
Yeah, all good. Elmer, thank you.
All right.
All good. Excellent.
Thank you. So my talk will be a bit different than the speaker before me. I will not be able to delve into the specifics and the specific requirements and the implications for from the Green Deal and the Action Plan on Circular Economy for the Northwestern region of Ireland. That's not the case, unfortunately. I will speak on behalf of Circular Flanders, and I will speak about the experience we have with dealing with the circular economy and the way that we approach it, the way that we think that we should cope with the big challenge of achieving climate neutrality and a smaller material footprint in the EU. So this is the talk. I'm going to talk about Circular Flanders and the Green Deal, and it almost sounds like a fairy tale, you know, Circular Flanders and the Green Deal. It's a bit mystic, and that's the whole case. Of course, it's quite broad and mystic, and at the same time, it's beginning to become really concrete and tangible, and we need to take steps in this very important subject. So I will talk about there it is. I will have we'll talk about these points. Why is Flanders a genuine circular economy hotspot? And 2 years ago, I've been talking at the Irish College in a TEX peer-to-peer program. And I had about 3 hours to talk, or 2.5 hours. And now I will try to do it in 40 minutes, 45 minutes, so we can have discussion afterwards. Let's start with the Flemish region, of course. We are a small but highly industrialized region. We have some economic strengths, logistics and ports, chemical industry, food industry, engineering and health. And we definitely have a high material footprint. We'll come back to that later. So this is Flanders, and there's actually no space and actually also no time to waste. We are densely populated, and we have a big portion of concrete, and the built environment is sprawling. We have suburban areas, rural areas, of course, but also a very large portion of cities and industry that occupies our territory. So this is important to show because this has made the region to what it is, and we early in the 80s we already discovered that we had no space anymore to landfill, and that was a start of a very profound journey into materials management, waste management. We started with the planning of landfill sites. We started with new incineration plants. And in the 90s, the last century, we've been extending our scope from waste management in towards producer responsibility, towards closed loop shops, sorted collection, prevention, waste prevention, and so forth. So in the past 10 years, 20 years, we've been gradually extending our scope and working towards a sustainable materials management program, which actually became a Circle of Flanders in 2017. I'll show you some figures about our advanced stage of waste management. This is part of, well, these are more or less the best, or the second best figures in Europe about waste management, about the treatment of household waste. So we managed to sort and recycle about 70% of the household waste. We have a monitoring of reuse, which is about 5 kilograms per inhabitant each year. We are banning landfilling, and of course it still takes place for unavoidable waste streams that cannot be recovered at all, but it's near zero. And we are well, we are in a stabilization phase of waste generation. So that's still a challenge. The numbers are about 7 to 8% lower than it's mentioned here. So there's still some progress, because this is only a graph until 2014, but still we have a big challenge. I will show you that. So how do we actually cope with this expanding scope and this challenge that we've been able to see and to follow up, both in Flanders itself and in Europe, of course. So I want to mention 3 extra highlights that are really important for our circular economy approach that still is valid today. Plan C started in 2006, and it was actually a transition platform for the sustainable materials management. Circular economy was not mentioned at the time, but it was practically the same. And the Plan C transition platform said, okay, we need to cope with this challenge of resource use, critical materials, and we want to bring together different stakeholders from different entities of the society, and we want to collaborate, create vision, do experiments, start experiments, do several projects, set up roadmaps, and so forth. So that made a big difference, actually. It was voluntarily. Plan C was a voluntary stakeholder group transition platform, but some rules and new practices have been decided upon, like the materials decree that radically includes material policies and end of waste regulation, and in 2010-2012. It was actually fueled by the waste directive that was installed at the European level, or the renewed waste directive at that point. And now we are in a new phase, or actually from 2016-2017 on, we've been recognized by our approach as a circular hub, and we get a prize for that as well. But that's of minor importance at this point. The most important thing is that we think and feel that we have a good tradition in waste management. We know that, and at the same time we have a good tradition in transition management and stakeholder collaboration, and that's really important to be able to actually cope with the coming challenges that we will discuss. So Circle of Flanders started in 2017 as a follow-up of the events and the stakeholder platforms that have been installed from 2006 onwards, and it's still there, and I'm part of the operational team. So let's see, this is Europe, and this is our graphic. It's been spread worldwide actually, but my colleague Karen has drawn this at a kitchen table just a couple of years ago. And we think this reflects one of the core elements, of course, of a circular economy. Not everything is in there, but it's a really important aspect. But it's nothing new, of course. The European Commission actually has been trying to promote the idea, or to at least research the idea of a circular economy from the 70s onwards. So this is a paper from Walter Stahel, who did an exercise or a research for the European Commission in 1976, 1977. But it stayed on the shelf, and in the 80s there was actually no attention at all from European legislation to the issue of waste and or product life extension or waste management in a broader sense. So it was on the shelf, and in the early 90s and in the 90s there has been gradually more attention given from academics and also from policymakers, but it was on the shelf until 2010, you know, when Ellen MacArthur Foundation started to promote the idea once more in the light of material and resource challenges worldwide. But from the early start, job creation and material resource management, geopolitical consideration, and even urban revitalization was involved. If you read these, these starting papers by Walter Stahel, you'll feel that it's not only about material use or a new business model, it's also about jobs. It's about environmental impact. It's about geopolitical independence, and it's about new ways to revitalize urban areas. So it's really important to see that it's nothing new and that it's still very much a thing that we need to explore with respect for the insights from the past. But of course, what Walter Stahel and the European Commission at that time did not see or notice was the big relationship with greenhouse gases. Materials are actually a source of greenhouse gases. This is a graph for 3 regions. The figures are not absolute, but they are pretty much give a pretty good indication of what we're talking about. Greenhouse gases in Flanders do account for 60% of materials do account for about 60% of greenhouse gases in Flanders, which is comparable to the figures from Germany or worldwide. The UNEP resource panel said we have about 50% of the greenhouse gases are related to the resource extraction and production of resources and materials. So this is important to notice, and of course this really sets the stage for huge new ambitions, which are actually, of course, translated into the European Green Deal, which we are talking about. So the basic goal of the Green Deal is actually to be climate neutral by 2050 and to emit less greenhouse gases by 2030, about 55% less. And we feel that the EC, the European Commission, really stands firm to reach these goals. Circular economy principles and the Circular Economy Action Plan are of great importance. It's on the top in this picture. But actually, if we would like to take it a step further and listen to the resolution that has been adopted by the European Parliament just 1 or 2 weeks ago, the circular economy principles could be very well in the middle of this picture. It could be a European circular deal and leave out the green one, or green and circular deal. The European Parliament really is underlining the general ambition of the Green Deal and says it's paramount and key to reach the goals of all the different Green Deal subjects to actually work with circular economy principles. It's in the heart of it, connected to every strategy and action. Circular efforts are crucial for the renovation wave, the strategy on sustainable mobility, the industrial strategy, sustainable chemistry, farm to fork, etc. And this is a very welcome resolution because it underlines perfectly what Flanders is doing and what we think is really important. That circular economy has to be applied and developed within programs and networks of the industry, construction sector, water policy, biodiversity policies, social policies. So for us, circular economy is a crucial leverage for these different Green Deal related topics. And that's what we're trying to do. And I'll go back to that in a minute. Just showing some more figures about the carbon and material footprints of Flanders. So we need to lessen or diminish our material footprints, and actually we have a raw material consumption footprint of about 29 tons per capita of Flanders, and we should. Our ambition is to diminish that, to lessen it with 30%. So 30% discount in the coming 10 years. And the ambition of 2050 would be to reach, you know, a raw material consumption footprint of about 7 tons per person, which would equal the fair amount of resources we could and should use if we want to reach global sustainability. And of course, it relates to the 2 degree Celsius threshold that we would like to obtain in the coming years, and to keep climate change impact well, considerably manageable and less severe as we are reaching for well, big disruptions. So this is a big challenge. For Flanders, we see the building sector as a big contributor to these carbon and material footprints. Food sector, of course, consumer goods and mobility. And of course, that's in line with the European findings. So what do? We have Flanders, we are a front runner in circular economy. We see that we need to decouple the material footprint from consumption by 2030. We need a reduction of a material footprint by 30%. And above all, and that's what we're going to talk about, is that we want to do it in a public-private way, public-private effort, doing this in a partnership across society. And just to add some targets for households waste, we want to reach 25% less in 2030. Company waste should be 25% less as well in 2030. Incineration should go down with 25% in 2030. And recycling rates should be up to 77.5%. So this is perfectly in line, and even more than the European targets will ask from us and from Flanders. But we have 10 years to reach about 7 to 9% more recycling rates than we have now. But the bigger challenge will be to reach a lower material footprint of Flemish consumption, of course. And we have to reach this, and we have to do this by circular strategies and working together in a public-private partnership. So this is what we'll do. We just about a couple of months ago, in summer of 2020, we decided upon this scheme and this approach with 6 thematic agendas: circular construction, chemistry and plastics, water loops, bioeconomy, the food chain, and manufacturing. And these thematic agendas are being developed and monitored and elaborated by a public-private collaboration group with specific dynamics, targets, and actions. So they're in full swing right now, or actually they're starting, and in the next 6 to 7, 8 months, there should be a plan and a working program for all of these thematic agendas. And such an agenda should actually unite the existing policy initiatives. It should unite different private initiatives and opinions, of course. It should bring together the main focus points of action. It should formulate targets for the sector and for stakeholders that are part of this agenda. So it's more than just policy making or more than just experiments. It's a whole a whole agenda with all different kinds of actions and policy instruments. We see for each thematic agenda, we have 7 strategic levers. We feel that these levers are accelerators for overcoming barriers and spreading good practices. We need to work on policy and policy measures. We need to use circular procurement as a strategic asset to become more circular in these different thematic agendas. We have to communicate and have a good marketing strategy around these topics. We've got to do research. We've got to work on innovation and entrepreneurship. We've got to have an eye for financing and business models, and of course, we need to think about jobs and skills for the future. Right now, we've been coming together. Apart from the operational team at Circular Flanders, we're working with about 100 co-workers that have been are actually working in these different thematic agendas or strategic levers. The big difference with 2 years ago is that we actually have a broader field of collaboration with more political backing to work with different people from different administrations. So we've always been very open and willing to collaborate, but it hasn't turned out always to be very easy to collaborate with everyone amongst different departments and so forth. So that's a big improvement in respect of in comparison with 2 years ago. And there's also a roadmap for circular economy, which will be launched in 2021 as well, with the broader perspectives and scenarios that we are researching at this point. We are studying about a bigger view on the circular economy, and we'll have a roadmap for that one. So this is the governance of Circular Flanders, how we'll manage it. We have 2 ministers that are actually responsible and working together on this broad field. The Ministry of the Environment and the Energy, and the Ministry of Economy, Innovation, Labour and Social Economy and Agriculture. So that gives us enough possibilities actually to work on these working agendas, and we have a steering group that has representatives from civil society, industry, finance, research, government, and civil society. And we actually expect a lot from local governments and local entities. That's actually also my focus point at this moment. to try to enhance the capacity and the awareness with local entities, with local governments, provinces and cities and regions within Flanders to work together on a circular economy. So we've come to a point that we are talking about the circular innovation ecosystem in Flanders, with a good track record of transition management and collaboration, with a lot of pilot projects, a lot of companies that are into the game. And I'll just show you two examples where this circular innovation ecosystem really works out very well. It's about circular built environment. And I'm sorry that I have not translated this slide in English, but next time I will. So please join me for the next presentation. We have about 69 subsidized experiments within the field of circular built environment. We have a Green Deal on circular building and circular built environment with about 320 participants. They have been issuing or doing about 160 Green Deal experiments. So all this knowledge is being transferred to one each other to have a bigger knowledge base, a knowledge to become a knowledge hub on circular building. And also we're working on policy measures, the Beleidsprogramma policy measures and the policy program, with also some binding regulation efforts for the construction sector. Another example is the work on a circular procurement. We also started a Green Deal in 2017 on circular procurement in Flanders, together with a lot of different players, a lot of local entities, local governments participated. We did about 30 European pilots. So we managed to have a broader European network and to join the ProCirc project as well. We have about 120 experiments on the Flemish side. We have a knowledge hub, and suppliers and demand can reach out to each other through our website and through our activities. So there's another talking point. I mentioned some talking points in the first or the second slide of my presentation. This is a talking point: public circular economy investment. Since 2017, so 4 times in a row, we have been subsidizing experiments and pilot projects, and we are actually seeing 220 co-financed experiments at this point. So it totals about 20 million euros in a 4-year period. Here says 3 years period, but it's 4 years period. And these experiments are really important. We've done an evaluation. These experiments are really important to start something up, and this is a big help for a lot of startups, but also for vested companies that want to think further, want to try something new. So that's really important. There's been about 60 spearhead cluster projects funded, but these cluster projects may well be in the sphere of energy or industry 4.0 or water-related projects. It's not all circular economy as such, but there are different bigger cluster projects in the past 3 years. We have some bigger industrial projects that have been funded with public finance, like we call it moonshot projects. And these projects are about transforming the industry, or think about, for example, carbon storage and utilization in, for example, the North Sea port of Ghent and part of the Netherlands. So I've talked about these green deals. We have the Green Deal on circular procurement. We have the Green Deal on circular built environment, which have been, which actually is not so much an investment, but it's in financial terms, but it's an investment in people and in the network. And the latest thing that I would like to show you is about the 30 million public investment capital that is ready to be mobilized for circular economy initiatives. And this has been propelled by the Corona crisis in last year. So Europe said, okay, you will need to of course, invest more in our economy, specifically during this crisis. And this relance policy in Flanders, we will keep about 30 million euros aside for investments in chemical recycling of plastics, solutions for asbestos, and also invest probably in diaper recycling. And we expect about 10 million euros for circular innovation in the building sector and 50 million euros for circular innovation in electronics and textiles. So this is quite interesting, but not all decided upon yet. So these were my talking points. There is a secret ingredient, point 6, and I'll show you that right now. It's fun. We reach out to people and students and young people, but everyone who wants to learn and wants to be part of this transition. Everyone's welcome, and we want to do it together. We reach at least 500 students a year from system and product design and also other disciplines from higher education institutes. We organize boot camps, eco-design challenges, and we set up professional collaboration with the higher education institutes. And we think that this is the recipe for the future. It leads to a mindset of the future. We have to work on educational skills everywhere and with everyone. Please have a look at our retrospective report for the years of 2017 to 2019. It's an overview of our activities, and you've already seen what we've been doing in the past year and what we're planning to do with the working agendas in the coming 3 to 5 years. And it really fits very much the urban agenda, the European agenda on the Green Deal. We think we're ready for it. We can cope with new directives. We can cope with new investment requirements. We can actually work with these European targets, and I hope you would do the same in your region. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Great, thank you very much, Elmer, for that report and details of things that are happening in Flanders. We have a couple of questions that are in, so I'd ask if anybody else has any other questions, they might pop them in the chat box, and we'll come to them. The first one is from Paul O'Raw, who wants to know, what is materials footprint?
All right, materials footprint is the amount of materials that you're actually using both inside your territory and outside your territory. So every ton of materials that's being used to produce your product that you're using in your territory, in your household, is counted. So the extraction of resources from abroad also counts, also is taken into account. Of course, you can have different figures as well. You can also look at your own domestic consumption of materials in your region or in your city or in your country. But in this, the graph that I've shown, we're talking about the material footprint from around the globe, according to the consumption and needs that you have in your country or region. So it takes into account all these numbers from resource extraction to transport to the use in your country and eventually in the use abroad, or the waste facilities that are also material intensive.
Okay, I hope that answers, Paul. If you want to come back, please do. A second question from Geraldine Canny. How do the subsidized experiments work and how are they funded?
Yeah, they were called an open call. We started with it in 2017. And we had at that point about 3 million euros to spend. And we set up, of course, a regulation or a way to apply a procedure, and we had a group of experts that would judge the proposals, and we said there's a limit to subsidy. You can have 100,000 euros, and it's 80% maximum subsidized. So your projects can be more, but we'll set a limit on 100,000 euros and per project, and you have to co-finance yourself 20% at least. So if you have a project of about 500,000 euro, that's fine, but you can also only get 100,000 euros maximum. So generally, these projects have been about this amount of money, and they've been evaluated last year, and we said, okay, we have to have we've had this open call for 3 years, so everyone with a circular ID or circular business ID could actually do a proposal. But the last edition has been focusing on the built environment. We had about 2.9 million euros to support initiatives from the built environment. So the first 3 years have been working on with a general scope. Everybody everyone could apply, and now we work with the building sector. And there has been a very interesting branch of the subsidy mechanism to support social economy initiatives and to set up social and circular hubs. But that's still going on.
Okay.
And it's paid by all government money, of course. So you've got to have a minister and the administration that wants to safeguard this amount of money for actual experiments and projects. Yeah.
Okay, if I could ask you too, Elmer, maybe in terms of your experience over the last few years and the transition that there has been in the circular economy, and what would you say are probably maybe the first 2 or 3 the best examples that come to your mind in terms of actions that have been taken at a regional or community level in Flanders? What would you think?
I would mention the green deals that we've been working on. It actually was inspired by the Dutch green deals, which already started about 10 years ago, something, or 12 years ago. There have been more than 200 typical green deals in the Netherlands, and in Flanders there have been, about 7 or 8 or 10. I'm not sure, but these green deals have been really pushing the agenda and have been really great ways to collaborate and to share knowledge and to do experiments. That's really important. And the Green Deal on circular built environment is really a success. It's so important, and we have a parallel to the Green Deal itself, which is actually a platform or a stakeholder collaboration. We have a research entity that's really looking into specific topics to research, to study. So this is a big importance. And also another initiative well, working with these young people, boot camps, organizing boot camps with higher education institutions, with education in general, because we're not only limited to higher education institutes, but actually to also reaching out to secondary schools and so forth. So that's our just two success stories, I would say.
And could I ask you, you showed the innovation, the circular innovation economy in Flanders, and of course Flanders is to the fore in the whole area of innovation. Just one of the areas I saw on the far left of the map was the area around the blue economy. Now for the Northwest region, of course, we have a very long coastline on the western seaboard, and there are a lot of businesses and a lot of efforts being made around the blue economy. In terms of the circular economy and the blue economy, where do you see the matches and actions there?
That's a very good question. We've had a person working in our team that actually went to the blue cluster 1.5 years ago. And the blue cluster is situated at the coastline in Ostend, or well, I'm not sure where their office is, but they're actually focusing on energy transition, and also working on energy on offshore wind parks and so on, and also working on sea farming or different innovation trajectories. But in Ostend, there is actually, which is a coastal city in Flanders, there's been a huge industry on offshore wind farming, and it's gradually also becoming a reuse and recycling and repair hub for wind farms and for components of wind farms, of course. So the blue cluster is indeed a way to focus this energy on not only on innovation within sea-related or water-related challenges, but also on circular economy-related challenges, like this hub in Ostend, which is really important for offshore wind farming and development of new technologies and higher efficiency gains for wind farms on sea. So this blue cluster is indeed something that could be interesting for the Irish partners. Yeah.
Okay, just one of our participants, and he'll also be speaking to us on Friday, Simon Pascoe. Simon, you indicated there you wanted to speak. I'll give you the floor.
Very quickly, David, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Good. Just to echo that comment, as a former project manager for the Port of Ostend, I can probably help a little bit here, because the Port of Ostend is heavily engaged, obviously, in that blue cluster there and the offshore renewable hub. There is an organization called REBO, Renewable Energy Base Ostend, which is heavily involved with all the onshore supply to the offshore hub. And certainly I agree, the decommissioning issue is going to become a major issue in the next few years in Ostend as the first generation wind parks come home. And of course, these blades and these technologies get bigger and bigger. So there is a lot of knowledge in Ostend, and certainly a big hub. And also worth mentioning, there's a very, very sizable waste plastics recycling facility now being built and is about to open. That's I think it's costing the region of 60 million euros. So it's there's some really interesting examples in Ostend for anybody in Northwest Ireland interested in the blue growth sector. Okay,
thanks for that, Simon. Maybe we'll come back to a little bit more of that on Friday. I also had a hand raised there from Pauline Grennan. I don't know, Pauline, did you want to come in on that? No, maybe that was a flash of the hand. Okay, just one final question then, Elmar, if we can. A lot of our participants too are also from the business community. We have a lot too from the local government sector, but also from the business community. And in terms of business's role in the circular economy? You know, what type of actions would you like to see, you know, happen, say, over the next 10 years as we look towards 2030, and what role do you see business playing, and maybe tying that in a little bit too with the circular procurement, and what sort of changes would you expect to see there? It's something I've seen in Belgium in terms of when we're putting forward tenders or quotations, there is very much this sustainability and circular economy aspect that we've been asked to justify. So again, in terms of going forward, what would your views be on that?
Yeah, we'll see a natural switch towards circular practices, and it starts with, of course, with a bigger awareness. And well, I showed you the circular innovation ecosystem. They are coming to us. We don't need to get to them or to talk to them anymore, or to reach out to them. They come to us or come to each other to talk about circular economy possibilities. That's a big gain in the last couple of years. But there's still a need to fine-tune and to fine-tune the collaboration between different companies. For example, the industrial symbiosis platform that has been active in Flanders. Well, it has been studied for about 5 to 7 years, and then it was installed last year as a bigger platform. The companies are still quite reluctant to share enough information about their possible byproducts and waste streams. So I would encourage them to actually to explore this a bit deeper and see what they can have or do with their materials that are considered waste or byproducts, and see what industrial symbiosis can mean. And of course, there are well, these circular innovation ecosystems on a more regional level. Like I said, North Seaport is becoming a hub, or the Ostend is a hub in circular entrepreneurship, not only with on and offshore windmill farming, but on other aspects as well, like as we mentioned, with plastics recycling of Renassi, but also in the different regional areas, like Limburg, or in the former industrial areas in the north of Brussels, which actually is the heart of the industrial revolution in the 19th century. And you have so many derelict sites and brownfields there, and okay, companies have to work together, and also with public entities to craft a economy of the future. Well, that's a big point. Of course, work together with your sector organization, but also work together with companies within your own neighborhood or region, and that's one thing that I think could be a next step for a lot of companies. Of course, if you have the bigger companies, then your scale is much bigger. Then you're thinking about European wide networks, but a lot of medium-sized enterprises should really reach out and connect to each other within a region. And we will try to help that, but we cannot do a follow-up of every project and every specific region. But companies should do it by themselves, or supported within a regional framework. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any further questions, thank you very much, Elmer, for your insight and the insight into Flanders, and we hope to invite you back to the college when we can, and hopefully we can continue discussions such as this. I propose that we take a short break just to give everybody some time to stretch their legs, and that we will come back at 11 o'clock Irish time, or 12 o'clock Brussels time, if that's where you are. And we will have Dr. Mike Clark, who will be joining us to talk about the EU's Green Deal and biodiversity. And then after that, we have two presenters from the European Centre for Policy Studies, who will talk to the Green Deal and the industry sector. So if we can take a break for about 13 minutes, and then we'll come back with the next part of the presentations. Thank you. Thank you, Elmer. You have it there, Mike? Yep. By way of introduction, Mike's work focuses on high-level system change and strengthening social cohesion in response to the combined nature and climate crisis. An advocate at the highest political level with over 30 years professional experience of UN, EU and UK environmental policy, he has worked with a range of strategically important economic sectors on the environment and sustainability. For the last decade, he was chief executive of the RSPB, Royal Society for Protection of Birds, Europe's largest civil society organisation for nature, combining practical delivery at scale with scientific research, policy analysis and advocacy in the UK, the EU and globally. He now works with civil society, business and government on environmental strategy and diplomacy, collaborative leadership and civil society capacity building, with a focus on interconnections between biodiversity, climate change, food and health. And I will ask Mike then to continue with his presentation in relation to the Green Deal and the topic of biodiversity.
Good morning, everybody. I'll just check that this is up and running. Maybe David, you could confirm that looks okay from
that looks good from where I am.
You. Let me just get back to the beginning. Yeah, that's cool. And sounds okay as well, I take it. So,
sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, David, for asking the Institute European Environmental Policy, which is one of the many number of hats I currently wear. I have to say it was an absolute delight for me to be asked to join you and offer some perspectives on the European Green Deal and biodiversity. In my past career, I spent about 20 years with senior level responsibility for nature conservation work for the RSPB in Northern Ireland, but working very closely with our partner Burwatch Island in the Republic in the south. And actually cross-border collaboration, which we'll come back to, was a significant theme. So I was over very often. I think it was probably in the late 90s when I first, not at this altitude, looked across Quilca Mountain between Cavan and Fermanagh and the Marble Arch Caves. And I have to say I've got a huge affection for the whole of the island, and I'll do my level best to offer some perspectives today. What I propose to do is actually not unpack in a lot of policy detail the biodiversity strategy itself. What I will do is I will send to David for circulation an annotated set of links. There's some fantastic resources on the Commission's website. Frankly, if anyone did feel that there was something you really wanted me to have contributed on and I haven't, I'll be very happy to follow up with email after that as well. What I'd really like to do today is focus more on what is often called mainstreaming. It's not a term I'm particularly fond of, but as I want to do is I want to make the case really and explain to you. Oh, sorry, just see if I can get this screen. Forgive me, folks. Oh, here we are. Yeah. What I would like to do, I hope that's changed for you too. What I would like to do today is, I think, first of all, it's important for me to set the scene and the context, because this is really about how to build biodiversity as part of the Green Deal into really how society chooses to develop from here. And that's a kind of very esoteric thing. And I've spent quite a bit of my time actually at quite an operational level. I was responsible for operations, for example, with relationships with business partnerships, about 30 small farming families around, this is the UK, livestock operations, and I've worked with many businesses. And I want to really think today how this might apply and how you might begin to think about some of the new opportunities that come through from the Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy. But this is very much, I think, for everybody, for all of us, a shift in mindset, really. And so I do want to spend a bit of time first off really about why we need to be thinking differently, how that kind of global context is brought down to a local level, and then really looking at what that might mean. And all I can do, and I do this with the greatest humility, is offer some thoughts in relation to the North and West region and some of the challenges and ambitions and dreams that you have, and to just offer some thoughts. And I hope that might just trigger a bit of dialogue as well towards the end. So I'm going to start off with a bit about really why we do need to have this shift in mindset, how that really relates to where we are now in terms of global context, but a local context, and then some thoughts in terms of where we go from here. So just really not wanting to labor these points a huge degree, but I think it is really important that probably the most important thing to get across in all of this is that we're really talking about an interconnected set of issues, of which biodiversity or nature, whichever you prefer, in which nature is a fundamental part of an interconnected set of issues that we have to tackle if we are to essentially maintain society and all that flows from it in terms of business, economy, all our life chances going into the next few decades and certainly into future generations. So without going through the list here, again, I'm assuming that you will all receive a copy of presentations afterwards. But essentially, this isn't just bit by bit, species by species. It's a structural, systemic set of problems that we have on Earth in relation to the life support systems on which we all depend. And at the moment, the direction we're heading in is really not a good one. We are effectively heading towards another mass extinction event, by which that means 90% of all species on Earth will go extinct if we don't change the course of a whole set of resource use issues that we need to consider that are really quite fundamental to how we operate. And already those impacts are having an effect. Degradation of land and seas and oceans is already impacting on over 3 billion people on the planet. And I remember a number of years ago when China started to first shift its policies on the environment, and it was because China's GDP was taking a measurable hit by virtue of environmental issues it had within the country. And of course, there's a global dimension to this in terms of some of that being driven by climate change and other aspects. So, and right now, in conclusion, we're going to have to do more. Even with the current nationally determined contributions on climate, we will not stay within a safe limit. And indeed, increasingly, the scientists consider that 1.5 degrees warming of the Earth is not in itself safe. So we have a lot of challenges there. And I think I just want to show how this is starting to translate into how mindsets are changing. So increasingly, ecological disruption is being seen as the biggest security threat to countries. Since 2018, the World Economic Forum in its Global Risks Report has been highlighting that the risks facing global economy that are have the biggest impact and are actually the most likely are all, as you can see ringed there, are all risks that are environmental in nature. And you may have just caught a bit of the news since Christmas, but we are starting to see ratings agencies like Standard & Poor's, downgrading or elevating the risk of big oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total, and a range of others, actually to a level of moderate concern in terms of their risk exposure because of the need to decarbonize. So this is really becoming a material set of considerations for policymakers. And at the same time, it's triggering big shifts in thinking about what does a sustainable economy look like. There's been work done over the last decade on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, but one review that has just recently come out that I think will influence a lot of international policy making over the next year and indeed beyond is a review carried out by Professor Dasgupta based at Cambridge University. And essentially, this was commissioned by the UK government, by the Treasury, to effectively do a similar global exercise to that which was done by Nicholas Stern, the Stern Review on climate economics, which prior to the Paris Agreement, leading up to that, I think was one of the things that led to a sea change in how the financial sector was looking at the issue. And certainly, as far as I see it, increasingly, really increasingly, businesses now, financial investment community are thinking about nature as part of that interconnected crisis. And so this is triggering a lot of innovation around developing circular business models, huge amount going on. And I think this is probably one of the areas I think we will see a lot of developments this year coming on at an international stage on green investment finance, not just carbon, but also biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I just wanted to give you an example of the growth, as you'll, I'm sure, be aware, in ESG investment, but the recent issue of the Irish sovereign green bond, as you may know, was oversubscribed by 3 times, although that actually didn't have biodiversity in, but we will increasingly see those sorts of financial instruments being developed for biodiversity as well. And equally, it's also recognizing this isn't just about the economy, it's actually even more fundamental. You know, there's a lot of heat and noise, obviously, at the moment over all the issues around COVID and where this has come from. I think we will see that COVID will become the latest in a whole series of diseases that have had significant SARS, AIDS, a whole range of diseases that have had significant impact on human health and life that have come basically by jumping species, the species barriers. There's clear evidence that nature loss is driving increase in those risks of zoonotic disease transmission. Climate change is increasingly recognised by professional health practitioners around the world as the single biggest threat to human health. And indeed, we are also seeing clear evidence that nature-based social prescribing can improve health-related quality of life. And in fact, I do remember, it must be in the late 90s, nearly 20 years ago, being up there on Quilca Mount and the Marble Arch Caves and talking to the Fermanagh Director of Health, where the local surgeries were now starting to prescribe nature-based activities in relation to improving some of their patients' quality of life and health. And increasingly, evidence is showing that the mental health crisis that is developing in many countries, COVID has not helped, and young people and social media, that contact with nature can be a major treatment and mediation of those issues. So what I really wanted to do there is show from a societal point of view and the future of communities, building nature, building biodiversity into our thinking and into how we develop activities is absolutely critical. And just really want to run through very quickly what is the nature of this problem then, and I will do a fairly typical kind of way of thinking this in terms of natural systems, which is the pressures on a system, the state of the current system, and then what the response is. So briefly, I've already touched on this, but briefly, some of the main factors that mean that currently our economy, it requires 1.6 Earths to provide the resources to function. And the impacts on nature, there's many, but some to pick out: land use and land use change and forestry, and especially agriculture, is the single biggest set of drivers, and agriculture in particular, worldwide. That is true in Europe as a whole, and it's true on the island of Ireland as a whole as well. our consumption is essentially based on linear economies, and that has gone way beyond the regenerative capacity of the earth. This can be very real in some parts of the world where we are seeing whole regions, for example, in the Middle East now living off fossil water, and actually burning fossil carbon and preserved carbon in terms of blanket peat is also one of those examples of where we're exceeding regenerative capacity. Pollution in many forms, but particularly impact on insects and invertebrates is a key issue. And linked fundamentally to all of this is the nature of our economy, as I've mentioned. So in terms of, that's the pressures, the state of nature. Again, some of this I suspect may be familiar to you, but Ireland mirrors the European Environment Agency's State of European Environment reports. Ireland probably in many different dimensions is below median in terms of some of the state of the environment. And again, I won't run through all of those, but essentially the trends we're seeing at a local level absolutely mirror and are part of that regional and global picture I've described. And I think also it should be noted that there are a significant number of current infringement cases involving Ireland and the Irish government under EU law, which again I think is probably a characteristic of the transition and the challenges that transition poses at a national level. In terms of the response and bringing us down to the Green Deal and where that is coming from a biodiversity point of view, there's several key things. And I think, first of all, the Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy in particular is a response to the Rio Earth Summit and the conventions that came out of that back in the 90s, of which the Biodiversity Convention is one, the Climate Change Convention is another, and there's a third one on desertification. And we will also increasingly see food systems as one of the issues that brings all of these different issues together. It's one of the main strands that anchors these things on the ground, and the UN's putting a lot of emphasis into the Food Systems Summit this year. And all of these are really seeking to make nature part of the solution. This has already been recognized in the Paris Agreement. So one of the really critical things in the Paris Agreement is, of which of course every European member state is a signatory in its own right, is that land use and land use change is a very, very significant component of total global emissions. And agriculture is now tied in to those emission commitments that contracting parties are signing up to. And so we will see over this decade coming an increasing need to square the circle between the way our food systems operate and the carbon emissions that they currently generate, which is about a third of the land use carbon emissions, is about a third of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are a problem. Actually, nature-based solutions, this is moving to more regenerative systems that work with natural processes, potentially mean that, for example, the agricultural systems worldwide could be about a third of the solution. So this is a lot about change in terms of how business models operate. So the European deal reflects this global backcloth. I think it's fair to say that when it came about with the new presidency, there had been some significant expressions of public voice leading up to the new presidency. There'd been some major large-scale public responses of citizens all around the EU in relation to consultations that the previous presidency commission had carried out. I have to also say, I think at that time, I've heard this from Vice President Timmermans and others, I think at the time politicians were underestimating the concern for the environment that was out there. That was also reflected in the elections 2019. And of course, the new EU presidency has put the Green Deal as a central part of its agenda. It speaks as well to the next generation, a generation that identifies itself far more than previous generations as being European in part, but also one that is very concerned about the environment. And we're seeing in Ireland, just like we are in every other country of Europe, and indeed pretty much around the world, growing public concern for climate change and protecting the natural environment. And that again is a kind of backcloth to how the Green Deal has come into being. And I think it's also worth noting that not only does this set a direction of travel in terms of commitments for the EU 27, but it also is very much, I think, seen by the Commission as a geopolitical positioning of the region in relation to other major economic regions around the world. So the biodiversity strategy is a component of this. And I'm actually going to start, I will just briefly give you a few headlines on the biodiversity strategy itself in a moment, but I'm going to start with mainstreaming, and the rest of my talk will really be trying to think about that in relation to your region as best, as I say, as best as I can do in terms of offering some thoughts of what does that, what might that look like. But the key thing is that the Green Deal sets a framework. It's no coincidence that the EU biodiversity strategy was launched at the same time as the Commission's Farm to Fork strategy. I'll come back to that in a moment. And there's several other significant components and pillars to the Green Deal: the proposed climate law, the circular economy, the sustainable finance plan. These are, I know, are other strands that you've been hearing about. And then, of course, there are some other very key directives already in place. One of the critical things, certainly of the last biodiversity strategy, and it remains, is policy coherence. So essentially joining up across silos in different policy sectors. And the common agricultural policy is essentially almost the other side of the coin to the biodiversity strategy. And this, at the moment, it does not present a coherent whole in terms of how you bring those two together. And the Farm to Fork strategy, as I'm sure you're aware, is a contribution towards squaring those circles and bringing a more coherent overall policy framework for the future development of the European Union. And I think I also need to point out that one of the other critical things in all of this is actually implementation. I was very heavily involved in the fitness check of the birds and habitats directives, key elements of the biodiversity strategy. And when you really boil it down, as is often the case, one of the critical things is implementation. And that's not just the performance of member states, far from it. It's also about how those things get translated from a European Union level down into member states, and developing best practice and sharing that is a critical part of it, and capacity at a local level. So really, just to give you a sense, my perspective on some of the headlines in the biodiversity strategy, and as I say, I'll provide links for all of this. But we're seeing a strengthening, a reaffirmation of key commitments, and this really reflects, really very much mirrors the international commitments that I was talking about earlier on, in terms of particularly the Convention of Biological Diversity. But I think the whole agenda we will see coming through, particularly this year, at a UN level. So this is both for the protected area network, which actually increasing to 30% of land and sea, certainly in relation to land, is not a very significant increase, just a few percent. It's more significant for sea. And similarly, that also is the case in terms of more strictly protected areas. But effective management, and referencing back to agriculture and other land use sectors, is one of the key other commitments in the strategy. And there are some proposals as well that I think will provide opportunities. Clearly, this will also steer funding programs in terms of a restoration plan, which will start to unpack into targets that will cascade down into member state level for healthy and resilient ecosystems. There's much needed prioritisation to go with that. And again, I think that will start to influence prioritisation of funding streams. I should say that probably one of the areas that is more silent in the whole of the biodiversity strategy is funding. You've heard on Monday from European Commission colleagues on the LIFE programme, which remains significant. But this is very much also weaving this in to other existing funding programmes. And again, might be something we want to come back to on that. And then there's also recognition that the governance framework in relation to implementation in terms of responsibilities and accountabilities needs to be addressed. And this, again, I think speaks to the need for a governmental level, cross-departmental commitments and interaction. Biodiversity, as I touched on earlier, is one of these things that weaves across many other sectors of public policy, and also then how that does translate down to a more local level. So I really then wanted to, if that's kind of the broader picture of the Green Deal, really that I suppose the biggest point that is to take away on biodiversity in the Green Deal is that this is about how to build nature into solutions, how nature can be part of recovery as a whole. And I've tried my best to think about your strategy as I've understood it, particularly thinking about the three strands that you have around better places, competitiveness and collaboration. And if nothing else, I hope these might just provoke some thinking. I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily the most critical areas to focus on from a biodiversity point of view, but I think there are some pointers to what the possibilities might be. So if I start with better places, clearly there's a very direct relationship back into the biodiversity strategy with regard to designations, protection and management, the kind of classic things of nature conservation. I'm, as you know, far more than I do, in your part of part of Europe, really. Blanket bog is a major component of the land surface of soil types, and bog restoration, in particularly natural heritage areas, is a key issue. But perhaps at the heart of all of this is working with farmers to shift farm business models and how to make space for nature, not just in terms of those ponds and hedges and corners of a farm, but actually how farms can shift to lower inputs, how they can work on more regenerative models of management, and that is going to be a key area, and how that support is provided, the transition arrangements, skills training, a whole bunch of things, ongoing financial support. So that's a really key area, and certainly a local area. I think skills, knowledge, capacity, best practice sharing, all of those things are very key factors for success. And I think as well is also recognizing it's not just farming, but there are many other sectors involved with land use where biodiversity restoration can be a significant part. I've worked with major infrastructure projects. My previous organisation was a construction partner with Crossrail down in London in terms of the tunnel construction, water companies, Again, we might want to talk about funding in the chat, but I was project director for a major Interreg program for Northwest Europe on the restoration of mineral workings. There are many, many aspects. Flood risk management, another key area. So it's thinking about how biodiversity can be integrated with those sorts of activities. And another one just to highlight is marine protected areas. And this is one that, again, brings multiple benefits. So that's in terms of place-based interventions, some of the things that are perhaps to be worth thinking about. In terms of competitiveness, whenever I think of this, I recall being very heavily involved in the regeneration strategy for the East of London in the Thames Estuary. And the point being made by the Secretary of State for the Environment at the time, that the only thing that locates next to dirty industry is even dirtier industry. And I think when thinking about competitiveness, this is about quality and ambition for quality. And essentially setting standards around environmental compliance is about creating a governance environment within which quality businesses will thrive, because they are the ones that wish to deliver on multiple benefits in terms of how they generate and build their business models. And I think that in turn means that and I want to come on to this in collaboration, is that actually exploring with the private sector, how can profitable business models be developed that actually have biodiversity benefits built in through the value chain? How can those be designed is a really key area of mainstreaming. And of course, that's, hugely easy to say and very, very difficult to do, but it can be done. And it's remarkable how radically successful that can be. And linked to that then is just the role that local authorities can play in terms of public procurement, and also the investment funds that they do have as a leverage in that process to enable better private investment. And then finally, again, research and development, skills and training. There's a number of EU funding streams and others in terms of framework programs, where again, using that for the benefit of helping business transition is, I think, all a part of that mindset shift. And then finally on collaboration, and I think this is something that particularly governments at every level has, all the way down to local community, has a key role to play, because a lot of this is about convening. And in terms of collaboration, of course, particularly for your region, it's important to recognise that in a biogeography sense, there is only one unit biogeographically, and that is the island of Ireland. And so approaching it on that basis, the data and knowledge base is significant on an all-island basis, but needs improving and strengthening. And that also applies to a range of other areas of collaboration, invasive species, pollinators. I think it's important to be working with civil society in this regard. Civil society has a long track record, as you know, in terms of developing some of the biodiversity for the island, and that's important. And I'm aware at the moment there is a consultation on climate and biodiversity from the National Economic Social Council, which speaks to this agenda as well. But I think that convening role in looking for the progressive and unlikely partnerships, bringing civil society players and businesses together, and then how local authority can help and enable projects and those partnerships to flourish, I think is a very key role that can be played. And linked to that is incubating new collaborations. Modest project funding can help build those partnerships. In-house support can often be a way of getting them off the ground. And of course, linked to that is then facilitating community engagement. All of these things are absolutely part of how to begin to mainstream biodiversity as part of the Green Deal into a local level. And then linked to that, there are funding streams which are there to help enable that kind of collaboration to develop. So in conclusion, I think really biodiversity and green as part of the Green Deal is really about a generational mind shift. And I think I increasingly ask myself the question, am I acting as if the truth is will? What does that look like? What does it look like for local leaders? And then how and who do you engage with to help address the reality and create one that the next generation can look forward to? So I hope that has been of some help for your very extensive review that you're doing this week. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions in the best way I can.
That's great, Mike. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for tailoring it as well to the region and to the objectives of the regional authorities plan. Again, if I could just ask if people have questions, if they can pop them in the chat, or indeed if they want to raise their hand, we can come to them and let them in to speak. I have a few questions, Mike, if I can. A couple of them you sort of took away from me as you went through your presentation, though. But one which we discussed earlier in our own conversation, and I was saying that it was one of the areas that the Irish College was quickly involved in with supporting Irish groups on the island of Ireland around the biodiversity and the implications of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union, and that border, I say in inverted commas, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and how that impacts now on biodiversity, particularly around the border area and the border counties. And that's an area where it's seen as going to be challenging in terms of managing that. And just wondering, given your own experience, what sort of insight you would have on that.
Yeah, I think, well, thank you. I have to say, I think I kind of regard it, I lost 4 of my years of my life to Brexit, and was heavily engaged in it. At one level, and I say this, you've got to remember, I've been born and bred in civil society, and at one level, my reaction is this is going to change nothing. We are going to carry on working together, and I can tell you, on the island of Ireland, I know colleagues dearly on both sides of the north-south border, and I have to say there will be a strong commitment to maintain that approach. It's worth bearing in mind that some of the information base was maintained throughout all of the period of the Troubles. There's a very proud tradition of working across that. So at one level, I think in terms of understanding the agenda, in terms of understanding the priorities for action, I don't think that will change. I think it's the operational side of this, and it's going to be very much down to the continuing informal relationships to create an environment where that cooperation continue. I mean, you know, when you start looking at how land management might operate, clearly there's the risk of, you know, increased difficulty of coordination. We may well see a divergence of standards. It's hard to say at the moment, but you know, that could happen across some areas. But on the whole, I'm quite optimistic from an environmental point of view. I think it's going to be the administration of it that's going to be more difficult.
Well, that'd be good, and if that's the only problem, I'm sure we can overcome that. And I know from the NWRA's point in the border counties that they work with, you know, again, such relationships will be very important, irrespective of the political structures that will be worked under. I have a question from Patrick Devine in the NWRA, and it asks, farming and agriculture are hugely important part of the economy and culture in the region. How can the industry change to meet the farm to fork targets, but without losing jobs on family farms, businesses, and also how many will have to go organic? Yeah,
I mean, this is yeah, I mean, almost like one of the most central questions, I think. It's a complicated one, I think. I think the reality is that over the next decade, we have to look straight in the eye at the environmental impacts that are a consequence of many aspects of current farming practices and look at how those can be adapted. I don't think we can pretend they're not there anymore, which is frankly where some of the public debate, in a rather sterile way, has been in the past. I think that is going to require, you almost have to start breaking this down sector by sector within farming. It will require change. A lot of that is linked to the financial support and signals that are provided. So I think we do need to see a big shift into farmers being supported to be able to do the things that do benefit biodiversity. You know, this is a system problem, not an individual farmer's point of view, farmer's issue. I think training and skills is a big part of this as well. And I think in terms of how can we change? It's hard to generalize. I think it does need to be broken into specific areas. With regard to organics, so let me just give you an example of this. I'm looking right now as we're speaking, I'm looking at the 49 sheep that are just on a little field we've got next to our house, and we've got an organic farm that has lent us the sheep for a short while. But that farm has diversified, has a premium on the organic sales. It has a shop, it has a tea room. And we can't have that on every farm, clearly, but I think it's a question of thinking about how businesses can evolve in a way that does provide a more resilient set of farming practices. I don't think it requires everyone to go organic, far from it, but I think it is about reducing inputs. I'm sorry I can't be more, I don't feel I'm being very specific, but I think this is almost something that requires to be debated at sector by sector level. The big picture on agricultural reform is to be giving farmers the support to be able to do the things that take them in the direction that I know many of them would like to go, and that would benefit wider public.
Okay, well, maybe just following on from that, maybe try and narrow it a little bit to be helpful. Like you were mentioning in that around the areas of training and skills and supporting the farmer and the sectoral areas and how change will be needed. And you'd mentioned in your presentation around the areas of funding. So all those changes require some element of intervention. So in terms of the funding mechanisms to try and achieve some of that, where would you point some of those to go?
Well, you know, you guys, I've been listening in over this week, and I know you have a very, very sophisticated and clear understanding of a lot of the funding streams available to you. So, in some ways, I would kind of say think tangent, think outside, think more expansively. So, for example, there is linking this straight back to biodiversity strategy and funding. There is the LIFE program. Think about how it might be possible to access some of those funding streams through, approaching it perhaps not through a conventional nature conservation approach. Think about the kind of partnerships that could be brought together. I just want to give, this is an English example, I'm afraid, but essentially we worked with a very major water company, upland water company, peat catchments, and by using forestry funding, farming funding, and then funding that's, financial flows available, investment within the water sector, we're able to help, this is over several thousand hectares, help the farmers who were the tenants on that land destock, reduce their stocking densities, put in fencing, and essentially give them the capital injection so that they could transition to that lower input, lower output model, but retain, in fact, strengthen their profitability. Now, that was all about thinking imaginatively of how to access these funding streams. So I would encourage that approach, and I would increasingly think about putting training and development as just as a component of funding bids. I think there's, particularly with the Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy, there is going to be, I think there's scope for innovative funding proposals to not necessarily challenge, but go back and push the boundaries of what has conventionally been seen as the sorts of activities that will be funded by some of these programs.
Okay, and I think we may talk about that on Friday when we talk about EU funding in terms of the need to be innovative in terms of what the Commission are looking for. And as you say, to push boundaries and to find new ways of doing things and changing.
David. Yeah, I honestly think, you know, people understand this is a huge transition. The leadership can come from every level. You can show the leadership and drive them.
Well, you've led me to my next question there, Mike, because what you were touching on multi-level governance there, and obviously as a regional and local structure, you were mentioning too about policy coherence around regional policy, and also the EU's restoration plan and the role of local governments and regional governments in that. So maybe you could talk to those issues around the policy coherence and in particular the restoration plan.
Yeah. So I think, as I said earlier, I really wouldn't underestimate the role you can play, and I'm particularly thinking of the Regional Assembly here, but the convening role. One of the things that is often needed is to convene the different players that are needed to create the innovation, to find the solutions, build the trust, create those, you know, kind of safe environments in which people can start to think about how they could work together for a goal. And I think that you know, you can have the kind of formal governance, and clearly that's important. So how you design your frameworks and programs, who's involved, how that consultation takes place. But I think there's a lot that can be done, if you like, through soft governance here in terms of bringing the right actors together. And I think there's an enormously powerful, you know, role for at a local level. This is been seen in, for example, the coastal zone, where often there's multiple jurisdictions, different agencies, and it's bringing those bodies together. I'm sure you already have a number of initiatives in the region, but thinking about how those can be developed, thinking about how you build capacity for collaboration. I would really highlight that as much as anything. I mean, I deliberately try to avoid getting into kind of the national level, kind of when I ran through some of those ideas. And I think it's how to use the assets you have by being the, you know, woven through the community and can draw those threads together.
And just on the community, we saw there from the last presentation with Elmer around community involvement, and we talked to in relation to the energy around the community energy. In terms of biodiversity, you know, what type of projects have you seen, you know, that are good examples of best practice in that area involving the local communities?
Well, I mean, we've spoken at length. Well, you know, I was trying to speak, and I still don't think I've addressed Patrick's question as well as I'd like to. But we've spoken with regard to the agricultural farming and agricultural communities. You know, one of the things that is incredibly powerful is to have a group network of farms working together. You can start to operate at a scale that delivers significant biodiversity benefits, and again, that's, you know, demonstrable impact for funding. I can think, I'm afraid this is an example up in, I think, Antrim, where a group of farmers working together were able to get some of those iconic upland birds, lapwings and redshank and snipe, and they were generating on a handful of farms as much biodiversity as there would be in 6 or 7 counties where I live in the middle of England here, for example. But I think there's other examples. One of the interesting bits of work that's been done recently is showing in flood risk management how involving local communities can increase the effectiveness of flood defences in terms of local monitoring, early response. And so, you know, that would be another very good example. Some of the kind of looking at whole landscape initiative and how you bring different funding streams in. Again, you know, a number of examples are there. And I think is it the Baron? I think there's 1 or 2 elsewhere in the Republic that have, you know, been very effective in that sort of thing. And again, if you can get that kind of cross-sectoral stakeholder involvement, it's a very compelling argument to funders and to government even to try to do pilots and trials, and maybe, you know, trials and pilots often a way of them allowing to sort of, you know, slightly stretch the funding rules to enable something to go ahead. So I think all of those would be examples of where involving local communities can leverage a strategic level.
Okay, and just a question in from Katrina Mean in the NWRA, and it ties into to something that has been out there publicly the last while. Do you believe that we should be moving away from blanket forestry plantations as it has a detrimental impact on biodiversity? And we've also seen some petitions locally, particularly in mountainous regions, looking for, you know, more plantation, you know, the reintroduction of natural species in those areas. But as Katrina says, you know, are we going to have a detrimental impact with this overplantation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, two things to say to start with in terms of need. I mean, as you will all know, you know, the area of natural woodland cover has been massively reduced in recent centuries. So there's a impoverishment in terms of natural habitats, and secondly, in the right places, forestry can and trees can be a significant contributor to carbon sequestration. The really big issue is the right tree in the right place, and actually there's an awful lot of places where it's just wrong place to have trees at all. And you know, certainly looking at this from a carbon sequestration point of view, the existing carbon stores in soils, particularly peat soils, but actually wetlands, mudflats, for example, in estuary areas, not where you put trees, but you know, some of those are as a carbon rich stores and sequestrate as much carbon as tropical rainforest does. So this is about being quite selective in what kinds of habitats forestry is put in. There's a lot of issues around the resilience ongoing of large-scale monocultures with climate change and variability and increase in terms of invasive species and pest outbreaks. So as you can see, I'm not a huge fan of large-scale afforestation exercises. But again, this is the sort of thing where with communities, there's a lot of scope for you know, more targeted, localized planting. And again, a mix of native tree species is certainly going to be a viable way future in the medium term in terms of climate change.
And then also, while we move in the NWRA, you know, inland and into that sort of space for plantation and nature, but obviously we also have that long coastline, you know, that runs from Donegal, and beautiful as well, and you're welcome to drive it along our wild Atlantic way. But it's an important part of the economy, it's an important part of our environment, and it's something that the region, you know, give a lot of attention to. So we've talked about agriculture and we've talked about forestry. We haven't really, you know, mentioned anything around that particular area. And again, just wondering if you had any advice on that.
Yeah, well, I think, well, first off, I mean, one of the things I almost feel bound to say is that there's, you know, at the moment there is from a biological point of view, biodiversity point of view, there is a need to increase our network of marine protected areas. And that's true of most of the countries on the northwest seaboard of Europe, and it certainly applies to Ireland. You know, there's, you know, this starts getting into the whole debate over fisheries. It's certainly, there's certainly a very strong case to be made that having areas that are, if you like, have more dedicated management to enhance biodiversity benefits fish stocks overall. There's many other issues in terms of bottom trawling and factors like that. So clearly there is an agenda there. I think it's quite well understood in many respects in terms of fisheries policy. I think on the near shore, actually the coast is, I think, another area. It's a bit like the debate into farming, where do we just see food production in isolation on land? Well, similarly in terms of on sea and on the coast, or do we see it as part of a multiple set of uses and think about how businesses integrate those more? And that, again, I think is a useful thought when it comes to the coast. But again, if there was an area, certainly my experience, where local government can play a big role in that collaborative approach, it's on the coast.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mike. I don't think we've any further questions. It was a very engaging Q&A session, and thank you for your insight and for your preparation as well. We do hope we can involve you in further programs and keep in touch with you. We'd be delighted to do something a bit more physical than in this format. But thank you very much for your time today, and we hope that we can see you again.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, David, and good luck for you all, and our best wishes, and thank you for asking for me.
And
Yeah.
thank you, Mike. Thank you. I'm going to move on to our final presentation. We have our two speakers who are going to present around the EU's Green Deal in relation to industry. And first of all, if I can introduce the first speaker, and then I'll introduce the second. The first speaker is Mallory Schultz, who's a researcher at the GRID unit of the Centre for European Policy Studies and coordinator of the task force on the new industrial strategy for Europe. Her core research interests cover EU and international trade and investment law, the WTO dispute settlement system and international arbitration, as well as EU competition law and economics. Prior to joining the Centre for European Policy Studies, she worked as a company lawyer defending the interests of Belgian companies. She has furthermore built experience through working with the WTO, European Court of Justice, and in international law firms. She graduated from the University of Liège and the University of Maastricht. She earned an LLM in international economic law as a graduate from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. She holds a PhD in WTO law from the European University Institute in Florence. And our second speaker will also be Milan Elkerbout, who is a research fellow in Energy, Resources and the Climate Change Unit at the European Centre for Policy Studies. His research focuses on EU climate policy and in particular on the EU emissions trading system. He's been closely involved in analysing the EU ETS Phase 4 revision process, and for a number of ETS sectors, he's been involved in projects regarding their energy and carbon efficiency performance and the impacts of carbon pricing. Other topics include industrial transformation and decarbonisation, mobility, state aid control, energy union, governance, and the impacts of Brexit. His academic background is in the political economy and in the European studies. So I'll hand over to Mallory or Milan, whoever kicks off, and I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for inviting us to your event on the European Green Deal. So with my colleague, Milan will make a presentation on the interlinks between the European Green Deal and the new industrial strategy for Europe. So starting with this new industrial strategy for Europe, it has been released just before lockdowns in March 2020, and it highlights the European Commission's overarching ambitions for the EU's twin transition towards climate neutrality, so the link with the European Green Deal, and digital leadership. This twin transition, green and digital, cuts across most, if not all, EU policies. And on my side, as the last item of our presentation, I will go through two different policy instruments regarding sustainable trade. Now, the ultimate objective of these two twin green and digital transition is to lead to EU's open strategic autonomy. Now, what does this broad concept actually mean? It actually relates to three variables, three core concepts. The concept, quite traditional, EU's competitiveness. So it's economic, and now it's even referring to its economic and technological sovereignty. So the term sovereignty comes back. It's then also related to a second core concept, very important to our discussion, Europe's sustainability, and related to competitiveness, EU's competitive sustainability. And then a third core concept related to the open strategic autonomy is the question of resilience, EU's resilience to external shocks. Now, depending on the EU policy at stake, those concepts which form the open strategic autonomy of Europe may be adjusted. So if you have seen, the EU trade policy review has been released last week, and their open strategic autonomy relates to competitiveness, but competitiveness related to resilience, related to openness. Sustainability is put together with fairness. And then there is a third variable for the trade policy review, which is assertiveness. So this protection from unfair practices from third countries and rules-based cooperation. Now, since the new industrial strategy for Europe has been released, we know there has been the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis in a general context of relatively uncertain multilateral order. And so since then, the new industrial strategy has warrants a reconsideration. And so last year has been adopted quite quickly the next generation EU, so the Resilience and Recovery Plan, and a revised version of the new industrial strategy for Europe should be released soon by the European Commission to reconsider the strategy and its communication of last year with respect to the new sanitary and economic circumstances. So I give now the floor to Milan, who is going to discuss further the European Green Deal, some of the interlinks between the European Green Deal and the new industrial strategy for Europe. And I'm going then to discuss about the sustainable trade.
Thank you very much, Mallory, and also thank you very much to David for having us here. It's a pleasure to join you. I would just like to start a little bit with a very general overview of what the Green Deal is in our perspective. So it's really for us a political framework that tries to give structure to all the legislative and regulatory initiatives in the area of climate policy, energy policy, and a little bit industrial policy as well of the current Commission. And in that sense, it is a successor to the Energy Union of the Juncker Commission, which already was a little bit of an integration effort in trying to treat much more closely an integrated climate and energy policy, which sometimes have been at odds with energy policy much more focused on traditional security of supply issues, and then climate policy more based on sort of short, medium term, but relatively modest emissions reductions targets. So with the Green Deal, a lot of this integration is continuing, and actually there's a few dimensions added to it. Most prominently, industrial policy is much more central to it, and there's also a very clear social dimension to it. So all of these different pillars, dimensions can be quite challenging to balance them. But what is also really different about the Green Deal is that one of the headline targets now is about climate neutrality. So getting rid of essentially all emissions in net terms by mid-century, and not necessarily about what we do in 2020, 2030. So it's about very radical change. But it didn't come out of nowhere. There's a lot of technical preparation that went into the analysis, the modeling for the Green Deal, and some of the key documents that were released more in 2018 and 2019 already were the updated long-term strategy of the European Commission, which analyzed how the EU could get to sort of this almost complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. But then also a number of impact assessments, which really updated all sorts of assumptions we have about where sectors are going, where low carbon technology is at. Now the Green Deal was really kicked off before the communication by the Commission came out by von der Leyen's political guidelines. And there were a few very prominent, eye-catching proposals in there. One of these was the idea for a carbon border tax, or the way we call it now, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the idea that if we import products from outside the EU single market, and they have been produced in countries with lower or less ambitious climate policies than in the EU, then that will be a reason to have some sort of a levy or another adjustment. This was one prominent example, and it will really continue to dominate debates for probably the next 2 or 3 years still. Then there is the idea of the just transition, which has also been coupled with some pretty specific funding sources to allow the different industrial sectors that need to undergo these radical transformations to also sort of cushion the impacts more on the social side. So it's about jobs, skills, retraining there. And then something that has also become a hot topic in Brussels over the last year is hydrogen. And then especially if it can be produced in a green way, basically with renewable power running electrolyzers. So all of these items were introduced by von der Leyen, but they then also need to be sort of signed off by the European Council, by the heads of state and government. This has happened to some extent, for example, with the long-term climate target and the carbon border adjustments. But yeah, the real work will then also need to be done through actual regular legislation, and a lot of that will be forthcoming this summer. It's this Fit for 55 package is the nickname of it, and this will lead to all sorts of changes on the emissions trading system, but also the balance between this emissions trading system and sectors that are currently not included there. And the most prominent ones there are the transport sector, basically all the cars on the road, and also the heating of homes and other buildings. Then a few other political questions still to be addressed is how many targets we want to have. Right now, the one that is really prominently under discussion was this net zero greenhouse gas emissions or climate neutrality by 2050. But for 2020 and 2030, we also have separate targets for renewables, for energy efficiency. There are some people who say that we need to have specific targets for resource efficiency, well, to reflect the circular economy more, and perhaps also for negative emissions, so that if we accept that we cannot eliminate emissions fully by 2050, how many negative emissions coming from carbon removal technology or even just increased forests, how acceptable is that? And this is a very political choice that may still need to be made. Unless my colleague wants to add something at this point, I can continue with a little bit on the interlink between the industrial strategy that Mallory discussed and the green transition. So the key thing that will need to happen here is that we will need to, for heavy industries, and the key examples here are steel making, cement production, but also oil refineries and all sorts of other basic materials, aluminium, glass, paper, etc. All of these need to be produced in a climate neutral way. And this is a very different debate than the average climate and energy debate we've had in the past 10 years, because it was very much focused on electricity. How do we get rid of coal-fired power generation and eventually gas that will still be up for discussion the coming decade, and more renewables into the market. But with these heavy industries, we have the challenge that we don't really have the equivalent of renewables, as in something that is close to commercially being available or already very competitive at costs, that can replace blast furnaces, cement facilities, etc. So a lot of technologies have already been invented and they have been demonstrated at very small scale, but you're really talking about less than 1% of the market. So over the next few decades, that will need to be scaled up. But we have the real challenge here that right now, even if we know how to build a low carbon or green steel making facility, the costs of that are enormous. So the traditional answer to this policy problem would be that, well, we have an emissions trading system, it puts a price on carbon, and therefore we just wait until the carbon price is high enough, and then these solutions will be in the money, if you will, and they might materialize anyway. So with the Green Deal and the industrial strategy, we are more or less acknowledging that this is not realistic, because there's a lot of technological and social and political barriers to getting these low carbon technologies into the market. So this is really where the industrial strategy comes in. We need to develop a whole range of other policy instruments that can also help reduce the cost of these future in green industrial technologies. And for that, we will need to create what is called a lead market for some of these sectors, such as, again, steel, cement, chemicals. And this will need to be done through quite interventionist policy. One challenge then is that the EU traditionally does not have that many powers or competences in a legal sense to do very interventionist industrial or fiscal policy. They can coordinate a lot and complement, and state aid control is one way to do that. But if it's really about strategic investments, for example, or other hard regulatory measures, some of them might need to be done by member states, unless there is an agreement that the EU can take over more of these powers at a supranational level. Some other questions that will absolutely come up when we start talking about the legislation over summer are the regional dimension of this challenge. So a lot of heavy industries are located in clusters, and especially in certain coastal areas around the North Sea. There's quite a few of them. And by focusing on these clusters, you can address a very large part of the emissions, but not all of them. So it's both a blessing and a curse. You can, by focusing on clusters, really make enormous inroads already if you are able to get these different companies that are represented in these clusters on the same page. But at the same time, you'll have maybe about a third of the emissions which are not at all located in these clusters. And then the question becomes, will some industries need to move? What are the social implications of that? Do we facilitate that, for example, with instruments that are introduced under the banner of just transition, or other solutions? Maybe a final comment I would make at this point is that when we talk about industry and industrial decarbonization in particular, the question of competitiveness always comes up. And one very difficult issue there is the idea of carbon leakage risk. So the main threat then is if we actually increase the pressure on European industry by, for example, higher carbon prices, or by stricter standards, or whatever avenue we choose to go with, will that not simply create an incentive for these companies to move either their production or even just their future investments to those regions in the world where the constraints are fewer? This is a huge challenge. And this is also where the carbon border adjustment mechanism comes in, but we also have free allocation in the emissions trading system. We give about 700 million of them to industries every year because we do not want them to directly face the carbon costs. This is a legitimate aim, but as we go further and further with industrial decarbonization, one challenge will be that some of the instruments we have available are very good at improving the competitiveness of industry, but not necessarily preventing or mitigating carbon leakage risk. So free allocation can do both, but not necessarily the carbon border adjustment, for example, because if we have green steel coming in from China, it will be very hard to apply an extra tax or an extra levy on that steel. So it doesn't help the competitiveness of European industry, but at the same time, there is no risk of carbon leakage anymore. So how will we balance those two overlapping but slightly different interests will be one of the big challenges of the next 10 years. With that, I will stop here for now, and we can perhaps zoom in onto some of the specific issues later.
Thank you, Milan. So I'm going to focus on sustainable trade. So sustainable trade is one of the four main pillars of the EU trade policy. So besides the question of protection from unfair practices, besides bilateral trade relations, besides multilateral cooperation, there is this main pillar, which is sustainable trade. It reflects upon the EU's commitment to a more sustainable, responsible trade policy. And it's already a commitment which has been met explicit in the past, notably the communication of the European Commission 2015, Trade for All, towards a more responsible trade and investment policy. It has been repeated in the current strategic plan of DG Trade and in the recently released trade policy review. Now, first, in terms of semantics. 10 years ago, when one was a trade expert, he was speaking of trade end issues. So the issues are all the legitimate objectives regarding social rights, environment, etc. Now, already in terms of semantics, speaking about sustainable trade is the wish really to closely interlink both sustainability and trade. Is there a definition of sustainable trade? There is no single uniform definition of sustainable trade. Why? Because there are different EU policy instruments that contribute to sustainability and are linked to trade, and that they follow actually different objectives. So you have purely trade policy instruments, and we go through what is called trade and sustainable development chapters inside the new generation of EU's free trade agreements. So these are bilateral measures, but sustainable trade may also be pursued through unilateral measures, and there we are going to speak about a hybrid proposal, EU proposal, prepared currently by DG Justice, which is this EU-wide mandatory due diligence law, and this would be a unilateral measure. Then there are autonomous measures, and as mentioned by Milan, the CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And then you have also other policy instruments which are linked to sustainability and trade. For instance, the product regulation, the recent proposal for battery regulation, looking at the different stages of the battery life cycle based on our current enhanced knowledge of the circular economy. So, and then there is also the step further at the multilateral level. What is now currently the discussion? What is the common purpose of the WTO in terms of trade and sustainability? So we are going to quickly discuss two aspects related to sustainable trade: the bilateral agreements (FTAs) with the trade and sustainable development chapters, and then quickly the due diligence legislative proposal, which should come in Q2 2021. So the new generation FTA started in the mid-2000s, so 2007, with the EU-South Korea free trade agreement negotiated in 2007, and which entered into force in 2011, and which is the first free trade agreement from this new generation containing a trade and sustainable development chapter. Other agreements have followed with such chapters like the CETA, Vietnam, or currently the recently concluded Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with China. So generally, those chapters, in terms of content, are comprehensive, are broad. That's the approach adopted by the EU. And in terms of obligations, so the legal prescriptiveness of those commitments vary. You may have essential clauses with hard obligations, and then you may have type of declarations of intent. Now, more specifically, what are those commitments and what are the objectives behind those commitments? First, you have commitments by parties to implement the multilateral environmental agreements to which they are party, and also to ratify and implement fundamental ILO conventions. And since the Paris Agreement, there are also stronger and more detailed commitments regarding the link between trade and climate change. Now, such commitments actually support existing international agreements, which often lack enforcement procedure. So it's, in a sense, it's a support. What is actually the objective is to make trade a track of EU's foreign policy and support the EU's value-based trade agenda and support multilateralism. Then you have more specific commitments whereby the parties agree not to lower their current labor and social standards in order to attract trade or investment, and also to enhance, but that's in general best endeavor obligation, which is to enhance the protection of their standards to the extent that they do not lead to protectionism. So this is the way these commitments actually promote a level playing field. And then there are new obligations, but best endeavors commitments regarding notably corporate social responsibility. And there is actually a link to make with the upcoming due diligence legislation, and also best endeavors commitments regarding the promotion of trade in environmental goods and services. And then this is in terms of content, and in terms of procedures, there are monitoring and implementation procedures inside those TSD chapters, and a specific dispute settlement mechanism, which, however, is very little used. So we have recently, I think the 24th of January, there has been the release of the report of a panel of experts with respect to the breach by South Korea of its labor commitments under the first actually new generation EU-South Korea FTA. Now, so when we look at the objectives of these different commitments, is first a foreign policy objective, and then also a question of fair trade and a question of free trade, no protectionism. The critique with respect to those chapters is first that for some, but it's quite quite widely criticized for being not sufficiently ambitious. So be it by the European Parliament, some member states, the private stakeholders, and civil society. So they should be more ambitious. And there, one example is, for instance, make the Paris Agreement an essential elements clause, and this has been confirmed in the trade policy review by the European Commission. Another possibility would be to make all obligations clearer, more precise, unconditional. Then there is a critique with respect to the lack of compliance, because some partner countries like South Korea do not necessarily comply with their commitments, and this over several years. And there, since August of last year, the European Commission has a chief trade enforcement officer, and one of his responsibilities is to ensure this effective implementation of the trade agreements, including the TSD chapters. And the European Commission is currently rendering the specific dispute settlement mechanism more operational, in notably creating complaints procedures directly towards the chief trade enforcement officer. But there are still not sanctions related to any non-compliance. So the European Commission is not in favor of sanctions in case of non-compliance, because there is first no consensus. There has been a consultation and there was no consensus as to whether or not we should have sanctions. Sanctions would be, for instance, the withdrawal of tariff concessions or fines, as it is the case with the United States or Canada. And so sanctions do not seem to be on the agenda. And it's also linked to the fact that the partners agreed to have to commit to broad TSD chapters, but then not to related sanctions. Now, the questions relating to these TSD chapters is, should we continue in this enhanced direction and even having more ambitious TSD chapters, rendering them more enforceable? But the first point is that everyone knows the theory of economic policies, that trade measures are not first best policies to correct market failures, and are even rarely efficient to address market failures. But the agenda for these TSD chapters goes beyond just the question of trade. It's a foreign policy objective as well. But then a legitimate question is, shouldn't we go towards more targeted agreements, like sustainability agreements, instead of putting it inside an FTA? Why? Because do we legitimately think that that our future EU trade partners would agree to such ambitious TSD, or are we going to exclude those partners who wish a FTA with the EU but do not wish to commit to the TSD chapters? So this we'll see in the future. Now, turning to the EU-wide mandatory due diligence legislative proposal expected in Q2. It's a unilateral measure. So it would be a unilateral measure prepared by DG Justice and announced in April of last year by the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. Now, this proposal follows actually a study by the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, supporting the fact that mandatory due diligence measures are more effective than voluntary ones. Now, mandatory, what does it mean? It means that businesses are required to carry out due diligence in relation to the potential human rights, but also environmental and social impacts of their operation and supply chains. It would likely be cross-sectoral. So currently there are legislations, EU legislations, which are specific to one sector, the timber sector or the conflicts minerals sector. And it would possibly also provide for a network of supervisory authorities at the national level and coordinated at the EU level. All businesses would be covered with an ad hoc treatment for SMEs. and it would provide for sanctions in case of non-compliance and perhaps even remedies in terms of civil liability. Now, the European Parliament has already published a draft directive on corporate due diligence, actually before, so it's quite unusual because it's before the proposal of the European Commission, so meaning that there is a real support for such a mandatory legislation at the EU level. Now, what would it create? It would create a level playing field among all companies operating on the EU market. And here you may understand why we put also now best endeavors commitments inside TSD chapters of FTAs, is that it's all companies operating, it would be all companies operating inside the single market who would have to comply with those due diligence requirements, and putting it in an FTA is actually already supporting this type of due diligence legislation. And so with this, I've covered two aspects of sustainable trade, and this is part, so sustainable trade is one of the tracks which are discussed as part of the new industrial strategy for Europe task force, which has been put in place by SEPS since January, and we are currently discussing these diverse aspects inside this task force. Thank you.
That's great, Mallory. Thank you very much, and also to Milan. Thank you both for your very in-depth presentations. We just have some questions, if it's okay. So I'll just start with one from Conor Feen, who asks, Milan, would it change the state aid rules to ensure state aid has to be green, require EU treaty change, or existing treaty provisions enough, or are guidelines sufficient in guiding investment?
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question. Normally, such a question is approached sort of in an opposite direction. What is allowed and what can we get away with, rather than what do we need to prevent? And the way the treaty is formulated now, it's actually state aid is never okay unless you really find a good justification for it, which indeed might be the case if it's about certain green climate energy related investments or spending compensation. So then the question is, would we want to use state aid control to prevent harmful types of public spending? I do think it's possible to use the current state aid control system for that, because you do have this catch-all clause in the very first treaty article saying that in principle state aid is incompatible with the internal market, provided you also have some threat or actual distortion of competition affecting trade between member states and using state resources. But those conditions are pretty quickly fulfilled anyway. Then on the suitability of guidelines, one downside to this whole system is still that you need to rely on member states actually wanting to hand out state aid, and not everyone agrees what state aid is. So half of the court cases will be whether actually all these standard conditions to be considered state aid are fulfilled. And obviously member states or regional governments, I think, would normally come up with different arguments there than DJ competition at the European Commission. So in that sense, it's a bit problematic that it's a negative power, which inherently limits how much you can harmonize. The guidelines, which are revised every few years, are powerful, and DJ competition has already put its mark quite clearly on a few test cases to really be quite strategic in trying to guide member state policy and member state action in a way that it itself sees as compatible with the long-term climate targets of the EU. There still was a lot of uncertainty, and also, I mean, while it is a transparent or somewhat transparent process with consultation on how these guidelines are drafted, it's not the same as legislation. It's very much soft law based, and that is a bit of a weakness. But provided you assume that DJ competition really wants to be quite strict with its interpretations, the powers are there for it to really have an influence. So it really depends on your own assessment then of how the guidelines have been shaped, whether that's sufficient.
Okay, thank you, Mila. I'll come back to you with another question, but first, Mallory, if I could ask you, you were mentioning there in terms of the sustainable trade, that sustainable trade is one of the 4 pillars of EU trade policy. We've seen too that in the Brexit discussions that this was a particularly important topic in terms of the reduction of environmental and social policies in terms of distorting trade. It's something too that at a local level, that regional and local governments have a role to play in terms of the environmental standards that they set in development plans and local regional plans and so on. And I'm just wondering, in terms of that at a local level, what can regional or local authorities do to try and support the policy of trade with industries in their area, whether that be around clusters, specializations, infrastructure, and how can they support the EU trade policy at a local level?
I will apologize because I'm not sufficiently expert with all these local local aspects, because here when you speak of an FTA, you speak of 2 governments, and there may be specific obligations, but in general is the state which is responsible of its sub-federal units. So perhaps Milan, do you have anything to add in this respect?
Yeah, being Brussels based, we are a bit
removed.
Inherently limited.
Well, Milan, if I could ask you then, just in terms of, you mentioned about Industry 4.0, in Ireland, industry accounts for about 21% of CO2 emissions. We also had the presentation earlier from the Circular Economy Organization in Flanders, who were talking about materials and change of materials, in different areas of industry. We also heard from Adrian Hill this morning, and he spoke about energy, and he was questioning, the viability of hydrogen into the future. He wasn't convinced that this was, a given at this stage. And just in terms of that transition and trying to reduce those carbon emissions, what can industry try and do? Given that, maybe hydrogen isn't the way forward yet, the change in materials is going to take time. We need research and development, to make those things happen. But yet we're facing 2030 targets and 2050 targets in a much shorter time than probably some of that can happen.
Yes. So I think the question of how to balance circular economy and resource efficiency with the more traditional decarbonization agenda, it's a very challenging, interesting question. There's a lot of emphasis on circularity the past years. It's perceived as a very positive agenda. And in a way, it's essential that you maximize the efficiencies that can be achieved through such a strategy, because if we would transform the current volumes of industrial production into low carbon production using a lot of hydrogen, potentially enormous amounts of renewables, potentially carbon capture and storage, the resource implications of that are tremendous. So with circularity and resource efficiency, we can reduce the scope of what we actually need to achieve, but there's intrinsic limits to it. So when we then talk about what is left, the primary production, that still needs to be transformed somehow into something compatible with climate neutrality. And I do agree with the earlier speaker that you would have had then saying that there's an awful lot of attention to hydrogen at the moment. There's a risk there. It used to be maybe a bit the opposite. So it's a pendulum swing back and forth. We need some of it, but it doesn't make sense to always use it because there's something inherently inefficient about using renewable electricity to run a complicated electrolyzer as much as possible during the day, only then to feed the hydrogen into an industrial process. If you can also do that directly, that's more the physics of it. So what can local companies do? Any type of investment that you can already foresee to be compatible in really a long-term perspective. So not an incremental efficiency improvement or an incremental emissions reduction technology, but something where you could say, if we would have this and we can scale it up by 2050, it could actually work, even if we don't have an emissions trading system anymore to cover the emissions. That is the type of investments we need, and it doesn't really matter where they take place. That's also a risk for Europe, because if they take place in the US, Japan, China, India, then the companies there can benefit. But any type of scale improvement, and so far the scale is tiny, will lead to cost reductions, learning effects, economies of scale. And this is where European policy should play a much more important role in trying to come up with smart combinations of private and public money. Not everything can be public, but we also hear from a lot of companies that there simply isn't an investment case to do all of these investments yourself. So it does seem to us that if we want to be successful in this, we need something of a market-based framework for the transformation and for this investment. And that limits the amount of public funding, but then, other policies should come in to make it possible for companies large and small to invest whatever they can.
Okay, well, look, thank you both very much. We have no questions and appreciate your time over lunch as well. Of course, you're an hour ahead of us here in Ireland, so thank you very much for giving up your time. And we do hope that we can involve you maybe in future programs down the road as this topic and this policy area develops. So thank you both, Mallory and Milan, for your contribution. That concludes our presentations for today. Just a reminder that we will be back on Friday, where we will have we have a member of the Flemish Parliament who will be talking about the Green Deal at local level in Flanders. We also will be looking at the EU funding streams that accompany the EU Green Deal, and we'll have the Irish Region's European Office, and we will have Simon Pascoe, who spoke to us briefly this morning, looking at that. And then we will also have a discussion with two of our MEPs, Maria Walsh and Colin Markey, who will join us then at the end. So any questions for our MEPs also would be welcome. So the NWRA will remind you and send you the link for Friday. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you then at 9 o'clock Irish time, 10 o'clock Brussels time. And thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you.